why don't we get started here? I'm going to show you real quick. I've got an outline here that talks about who I am and why why you should even trust what I'm saying to begin with. So, okay, who is this Blendrix guy? I've been an electronic music fan since 1999-ish. I attended my very first festival in 2008, and basically I was hooked right away. I needed to start doing this immediately, and so I started producing. Very, very, very basic. I was using some, I don't even want to say what software because it's embarrassing, but gradually I made my way over to Ableton Live in 2009, right around the same time I was DJing. I started DJing, and then in 2010 I co-founded House of Dub with a few other people here in northern Colorado. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a collective of, hey, how's it going? Got some more students showing up here. It's a collective of DJs and producers in northern Colorado, and we've been performing at the Aggie and other places around Colorado for almost, I think it's been just about 3 years now. So yeah, do I even know what I'm talking about? Yes. Right now I'm actually trying to get official certification from Ableton, which is why I'm running this class. But I do have pretty decent credentials, as you can see here. Performed basically all over Colorado and even out of state a little bit. Open for some pretty big names too. So more importantly, though, for this workshop is the fact that I do have a pretty significant catalog of originals, remixes, and mashups. So I have a lot of experience working with this actually hands-on. And so when I have run into a problem a lot of times, I remember exactly what it was, and I can hopefully pass that knowledge on to you and say, oh yeah, that was really frustrating when that happened to me the first time. Here's how you fix it. So personally, I was recently signed with Infectious Records in Denver, and I have a couple different EPs coming in pretty soon here, so keep your ears peeled. I don't know, but the right ear to the ground, that's the one. Yeah, I apologize for the late start. We do have a ton of material to cover. I hope that you guys don't mind if we keep the pace pretty fast here, and if you wouldn't mind holding all your questions to the end, and then we can always. The nice thing about this, the way that Hangouts work, is that it's being recorded in real time, so you can always go back and watch it again if you need to. So. Here we go. Welcome to Ableton Live. The basic layout and workflow is the beginning of this thing. I'm going to start with the session view, which is view. Oh, there we go. This is the view that you see when you first open up Live. Actually, you normally see one that doesn't even have any of this coloring stuff on here. It's very, very plain looking usually, but a lot of times people go, "What do I even do with this? This doesn't look like music. How do I make music with this?" And it was. I had the same confusion when I started, and it just basically takes sitting down and spending a few hours really getting used to knowing what everything is and where and how to link them all together. So clips. In this mode, each of these little areas that you see in here, these are places where you can have a clip play. And I apologize, but I need to get some of this stuff a little bit less in your face because it is totally taking up my entire screen. So there can be there's two different types of clips you can have. There's audio clips and there's MIDI clips. An audio clip is where you actually take an audio sample and put it into one of these boxes, and then when you have that box, you can actually trigger that box by using a MIDI controller, or it can be set up with timing. Like you can write a script that will go through and trigger them at the right times. You can have randomizers that trigger them, but basically they have to be triggered by some sort of control. Like I said, you can have either MIDI ones or audio samples where it's just an audio file that's in there. The MIDI is basically it's notes on a piano. This is a piano roll here. It probably looks a little more like a piano now, but you can draw the notes in, or if you happen to have a MIDI keyboard, you can actually record them in if you're the piano playing type. Yeah, that's kind of how that works. So that would be a MIDI clip there. We'll get more into that stuff later, but that is how you need to understand the session view. And the session view is what I would consider the kind of the building blocks of a set. When you're getting ready to make a track, you would want to get everything put together in this view first. put all your make all of your instruments using the channel here. You're adding in if it's a bass, obviously you're going to put in some sort of, either it's a virtual instrument that makes bass, or you're going to be using a bass sample. Either way, you have all the building blocks here, and you can make all these little clips, and then you can play them using something like a controller, and you can play them in a row. You can play them all together. You can use this scene mode over here where you're playing. You hit 1, and it will play all of them across, at the same time. So that's why it's called a scene. Basically, in an auditory sense, you're getting a little bit of everything. You got the cars passing in the background, little birds chirping, people talking in the background. All of those things are different samples, but when you hit scene 1, it plays all of them at the same time, and you can include parts in the scene about how you want those clips to be modulated as well. And we'll get more into that also later. So. Another thing to keep in mind that about clips is that they have these control buttons on them. So, when you click play, it plays that clip, and every time you click it, it plays it again from the top, based on your quantization settings, which is another thing we'll probably have to get into probably at a later date because we don't have enough time for that today. But with this, you have the ability to, like I said, you can play that all at once. This plays that clip and that clip and that clip all at the same time, but when you play the next scene, it automatically stops that one. And the reason for that is because it has this stop button on it. That means that it basically, as soon as you play this scene 2, this blank area here says, okay, let's go ahead and stop any other clips that are playing. Similarly, if you had a second clip here and you play, it stops the one that was playing before. And the way that you get rid of that issue, like if you wanted to have just one at the top here and that was the only one that was going to be playing for the next 3 or 4 scenes, you could remove the stop button from the next 3, and then that way when you play the next 3 scenes, it doesn't actually stop that clip from playing anymore. So that's a nice thing to keep in mind, because it'll make sure that you don't end up going, why do I have to copy the same clip over and over again just to make it play the same notes? So, all right. Oh, another thing. If you have a clip that you go, okay, cool, I like how this one sounds, but I don't want it to play here, but I also don't want to get rid of it just yet. I really want to keep that element, maybe that note progression, you don't have a place for it yet, but you're like, I like that creative material, I want to hold on to it. You can actually hit the 0 button, and that deactivates the clip, so that when you play that scene, it doesn't actually play it with any of the other clips, but it's still there. All the notes are still there, any of the modulation you put in there is still there, it's just deactivated, and you can turn it back on by hitting 0 again. So, alright, so we already talked about scenes. Alright. Channels. Each one of these vertical stripes that you see here is a channel. They consist, as you know, of the title at the top here, all of the clips in them. These are what they call sends. It's a knob that helps you control the amount of the signal that's coming out of this channel and going into the returns, which are over here. We'll get more into that later, but it's basically just a way for you to add various different levels of effects to your different channels without having to have all of the effects that you want separately assigned to each one of these tracks, because every time you get an instance of an effect going, it uses up some of your CPU. So to conserve on some of that, you only have one set of effects going in your return channels, and then you just route various amounts of your different chains to those. Okay? So in the channels, we've got various different buttons here. There is the arm, solo, mute, gain. All right, arm is this one here at the bottom. If that red light isn't lit, any notes that you play don't actually do anything. You know, right now I have it set up so that my computer keyboard actually is a MIDI keyboard on here. So, you know, you'll see that as I'm typing these keys here, I'm getting MIDI signal input, so that's what this little light up here means, but it's not doing anything because there's nothing armed. But if I were to arm this channel, you'd be able to see, and you can't see in this mode because the screen is still a little too scrunched, but over here you should be able to see, yep, you see that little blinky light there? That means that it is getting now MIDI signal, and if I were playing, if I actually had an instrument in here, you would hear sounds coming out. So for now, again, we're trying to keep it basically the functionality of the program and not necessarily on the sound design stuff. So I'm keeping out of that stuff for now. All right, back over here. Let's see, arm solo. Solo would be this button here, that little blue light. That means if everything is playing and you only want to hear just one instrument, this is really helpful for when you're trying to work on like a bass line or a percussion, something that needs a little more, I guess, specific work on the subtle details, and you have a hard time hearing all that stuff if all the other things are playing at once. You hit that solo button and then it'll make only that track play. Even though the other ones are still playing in the background, that one is the only one you actually hear. So that's also fun to do when you're playing live. It's similar kind of techniques can be used where you're dropping out one of the instruments, like you'll hear a lot of times in the drop of a lot of major dance music tracks where they'll take all the percussion out and it's just the bass lines playing, or they'll have everything out except for the drums for a portion. You can use that. You can use the solos and you can use the mutes for that very same purpose. These are the mutes. When you turn that off, that means that channel is no longer playing, even though it's still playing in the background. You just don't hear it. So, all right. So the gain. Now this vertical line that you see here. The reason that these are all turned down, and you'll see that here that they're all turned down to like -12 dB, or I guess now that I'm clicking on them, they're not anymore. But they were all -12 earlier. The reason that they are is because you don't want to have your volume levels starting at the 0 dB level. 0 dB is basically the point at which digital audio systems will actually start clipping if you go over that. Clipping means that your audio signal is actually exceeding the amplitude capacity of the digital signal processor, and when that happens, you get this sound where the waveform is actually being chopped off at the peak and the trough. So instead of being, if it's an even sine wave that you're starting off with, which is just steady up and down cycle, you get this something closer to a rectangle shape, or what they call a square wave, which in certain situations that can sound good, but you don't want that to ever happen on any of your channels or on your master channel, because that's unwanted distortion and it's uncontrolled. There are types of distortion plugins that you can put in that give you the right kind of distortion, and distortion that gives you some control of the types of like flavor and the saturation and all that. So it's it's something to be aware of and to watch your levels on here, because if you've got a level that's going up into the red, you want to dial it back. I usually start mine at -12, so that never even happens in the first place. And that's a process called gain staging. I think I might have actually just skipped a little. Oh, I didn't skip that far forward. Cool. Right on. Okay, so these are the pans. You're going left and right. So a little bit to the left like this, it's just going to be barely in your left of center, but you're still going to hear it out of both speakers. Pretty much, you're still going to hear it out of both speakers all the way until somewhere like right over here, and then it just gets further and further out of that side of your audible scope. So these are great for when you're setting the pan of a track for the or of a channel for the entire set or for the entire track that you're making. These are not good for modulating. Like, you don't want to automate these. It's possible to do it, but it gets messy, and it's hard to do them with clips. It's possible to do it in this arrangement view, which is where a lot of people end up doing their final arrangement of a track. But when you're doing the initial parts of it, if you want to be panning around it all, you want to use the there's another tool that I'll show you here in a bit that's actually part of the signal chain down here that does your panning for you. All right, so talked about the sends, channel types. Okay, so I think we mentioned earlier that there's audio and there's MIDI channels. They aren't, it's not obvious when you're looking at them when they're already labeled like this, but when you go to add a new one, the first thing you see is insert audio track or insert MIDI track. You can also insert a return track, which is what all those ones were that I was showing you over here earlier for handling effects, but we're not going to do that for now. So when you add an audio track, it's titled audio. When you add a MIDI track, it's titled MIDI. Simple enough. Pretty much the only difference between them is that you can put MIDI instruments into a MIDI channel, and you can't put them in an audio channel, and vice versa. It's actually interesting because you can put audio samples into a MIDI channel. You just have to put them inside a sampler instrument. So basically, you could take like an audio clip and put it inside a sampler. There's an instrument over here called Simpler that's a good example of that. You just drop it into your MIDI channel, and then you could put an audio sample in there. Thing though is that every time you hit that note, it triggers the sample over and over again. You can adjust some of that too, but it's sometimes easier just to have the sample in there by itself, especially if you're using it as a whole track, like if you're using Ableton for like a DJ set type of thing. So, all right, back to the lesson plan here. All right, so we were just in session view. We're now going to go to arrangement view, which is, oops, that would be this one. You can also get back and forth between these different views by hitting the tab key. It's a nice little shortcut. This is the view that's most similar to other digital audio workstations that you may have worked with before, such as FL Studio, Cubase, Logic, somewhat Reason. I feel like Reason has a very different look and feel, but it does have a very similar, the core of it anyway. The arrangement view is similar as well. So this part will seem probably the most familiar to people who have used other digital audio workstations before. But if this is your first go, then it's probably all looking like an alien spacecraft. So bear with me; it will all make sense in time. In this view, you've got basically, this is a timeline left to right. You start over here at the left, and as the song is playing, it progresses like this. You see this up here. This is the beat counter. This is the number of measures and beats and partial notes in between. So this is a loop brace. Right now the looping is turned on, which means it'll play this portion over and over again. You can adjust the length. It'll play a shorter time frame. You can also just turn the loop off so that it just plays past it. But that's pretty much the only thing that makes this different from the session view, in the sense that you can make a timeline from left to right, and then whatever's set up to play over here gets played first, over here gets played next, all the way forward. And then you can use this down here at the bottom to give you an idea of the length of time that the track has been playing at that point. So say you've built all the way up to here, you go, okay, great, that means I have about 1 minute and 30 seconds worth of material in this track. All right, automation lanes. This is another thing that's a little bit different about session view than it is with arrangement view. In arrangement view, there's these little pink lines you'll see in here, and this is basically your ability to add some automation to the track. And let's say that you wanted to change some aspect of the way that stuff was playing during this portion of the sound as it's playing. You want to say maybe change the pitch or change any parameter. You can go into here, and there's different macros that you can assign in here. These are, this is the crossfade between different voices of the bass synth that I've got in here. This is the crossover for where the sub bass crosses over into more of the character qualities of the bass. We'll get more into the actual instrument rack here in a bit, but the idea here is that you can take any of these, say you want to automate the crossfade. You go in here and add little points on this line. Just simply clicking once gives you the ability to add what I call it a node. I'm not sure what other people call them, but then you can go in and you can create these nice little patterns, right? Now, as that's playing, that should be turning whatever it is that's controlling. See how that's moving now? is moving automatically, and now like whatever changes that would make to the sound are going to happen automatically. So that's how a lot of these producers that make really complex sounds that happen in a very short period of time, lots and lots of, you probably heard it in like Complextro and other things. What they're doing is modulating parameters of the synths they're using, and possibly even different voices of different synthesizers entirely. So, but that's basically what an automation lane is here, and you can use that across different clips. Like if I had a different clip over here, I could continue with the automation over here. That's the main difference between the automation in arrangement and session, because in session view you actually build the automation into the clip itself, and I'll show you a little more about that in a minute. But let's get over to the notes here. And okay, so basically sort of basic navigation functionality here is zooming. To get zoomed in, you're going to hover your mouse over this little area right up here, and when you see that little, I guess it looks kind of like a magnifying glass, click on it, and then if you drag up with your cursor, it zooms out. If you drag down, it zooms in. And if you move to the left and right, of course it moves to the left and right. And so with that, you can find your way to a very, very small spot, or zoom way out, come over here. It's very easy to navigate to exactly where you're trying to go. And that very same thing applies whether you're looking here in arrangement view, or you can also do that in an individual clip view as well. Okay, the pencil. So this is another thing to keep in mind. So we just drew that automation in as gradual lines. You can also draw it in as fractions of the note sequence. So this is based on your zoom level. So if I zoom in closer, they get more granular. But it allows you to create more digital sounding steps in the changes of your sound rather than the slides. They're both useful, and you'll probably end up using them both at some point. It's just a matter of knowing how to turn it on and off. So that's that little button right there. When you turn it back off, all of a sudden now you have all these little other things. Sometimes I've found it fun to go in and have it on pencil mode first, make a very digital sounding modulation curve, and then go in and remove some of the nodes, or maybe go in and add some like, if you hold down the option button when you're hovering over one of these sections here, you can add like curve to the, that kind of thing. So you can make some really interesting sounds by doing that stuff, and again, that applies in the clips as well as in the arrangement view. Play, record, metronome, tempo. Okay, so this is the play. Obviously, it's playing now. If you play again, it just keeps playing from the place you had selected. If you hit stop, it stops in place, and if you hit double stop, it basically moves that play position back to the beginning of the track, which is very useful if you want to one more time from the top type of thing. This is the record button. When you hit this, it starts recording whatever is currently armed. So if I were to arm this track and start recording, see, I'm typing stuff in on my keyboard right now, and those probably would sound horrible if they were actual notes, as I'm not playing anything real. But that's how you record something in real time, just like that. Right now, it's in an overdub mode where it's erasing the currently existing keys that have been played. There's a mode you can in record where you can actually have it, instead of replacing them, it adds to them, and I believe that's this one here. Yeah. So when you're in this mode here, it doesn't erase the previous stuff. It just adds more on top of it. So you say you could play a lower, like a bass line first. Wait till that one's finished playing, and then when the loop comes back again, you go back and play the same sequence of notes an octave higher, or however you like to do it. Basically, that's why that feature is there. So, all right, back to here. Tempo. So 140. That's pretty much everyone's favorite dubstep beats per minute. Technically, if you wanted to get correct about it, dubstep is usually 70 beats per minute because of the fact that what you're hearing is about 140 beats per minute at half time. but it's a lot easier to mix it with things like electro house and breaks and other genres that are in the higher beats per minute range, like between 120 and 135. If you consider dubstep 140, you can just slow it down a little bit or speed them up a little bit and then merge them together, because halftime beats can match with their double time components or their double time counterparts. So don't want to get too much into the music theory with this stuff, mostly just in the software, but that's kind of that's what that is there. Oh, and then you can change the tempo by dragging up and down. You can also type in a specific one. So I was like, I want to make an electro house track, 128. You can also tap to get your tempo. So like if you're trying to match a tempo that you're hearing somewhere, you're like, oh, I really like that tempo, but I don't know how many beats per minute that is. You can just tap with your mouse until it gets to approximately the right tempo. These are nudge buttons, which is kind of like a platter nudge. It's basically for a fraction of a second, it's slowing it down or speeding it up. If you were using an actual turntable, this is like taking your fingers and either dragging them on the edge of the turntable as it spins by to try to slow the record down just a tiny bit, as if it's already in the right tempo. It's just not quite beat synchronized yet. So you slow it down a little bit, or you sort of give it a little nudge to push it faster. That's what these buttons are for. That's more useful like if you're trying to mix into someone else's set, like if you're playing live and you want to be kind of a show off and you get up there, yeah, you know, you don't even need to turn yours down, I got it, boom. So but that's kind of what you would use those for. Not really relevant for producing, but a lot of people use Ableton Live not only for producing but for performance as well, so it's good to know that. All right, let's see, we talked about the overdub. Back to arrangement. So this is a thing that we were looking at earlier, and the reason that when I was putting I had that automation stuff in there, and it was even though I had already put the automation lines in and it was playing over them, it wasn't actually making changes down here. And the reason for that is because it was still basically in session mode, where the session automation was what was controlling what was actually being done to the track here. And there's a button here, that's this one here. It says back to arrangement. That means when you're in arrangement mode, if something that you're adding in here, modulation or any sort of stuff, for some reason isn't playing, look at that button, and if it's red, that's why. It's because it's still thinking that it should be listening to session view rather than arrangement view. So that's how you fix that issue, and that's that little button right there. All right, so back to CPU indicator. This is pretty key. Up here in the upper right hand corner, if you're using a lot of different effects, a lot of different channels, especially if you're doing a lot of your audio is actually being generated on the fly by a software synthesizer. If you're running a lot of things through, like reverb is a very processor intensive effect as well. So especially if you're running a lot of that kind of stuff at once, you're going to see this number start just creeping up. Even if you're not even playing anything, it'll just be sitting there. I mean, I have some of the sets that I've got where they're not even playing, and it'll be sitting at 35% CPU, just sitting there, just existing. So you know, it's for that reason, it's important to keep in mind a couple of different things. You want a powerful enough computer to handle the job, but also if you're not going to have a powerful enough computer for keeping a lot of stuff in real time, it does make sense a lot of times to freeze and flatten your channels, which is basically to take whatever you have currently, and then you can right click on it and you can freeze it, which basically takes whatever it is currently and then renders it out to an audio file, saves that separately, and then plays that instead of using the CPU for that section. But it also allows you to undo it. You can say, I need to unfreeze that because I need to go back and make a change to it. If you actually flatten it after you've frozen it, that takes that rendered audio file and makes that the new channel. And so it is not reversible at that point. That's usually once more like you're in the mixing and mastering phases of your production, and you want to give a lot of CPU time to the mastering plugins. So, but again, that's something we probably don't have a lot of time to touch on today. So. All right, tips, tricks, shortcuts, copy, paste, duplicate time, copy, paste, all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's the same shortcuts as pretty much everything else. Looking at it here, cut, it's Control X or Command X. The difference is that you've got these time components here. The difference with that is that you can actually, with cutting, you're just taking it from one place and putting it somewhere else, right? Copying, you're taking it from one place and putting it in another place. Pasting, it's pretty much the same stuff. But if you use the time component instead, watch what happens here. So say I wanted to duplicate this, whatever I have on this section of the track is like, I love this section here. I need to elongate that a little bit. I need a little more intro. But I've already got stuff over here, but I don't want to like overwrite that. And say I've already got 10 or 15 different channels here, and they've all got different lengths of stuff on them, and it's going to be a real pain for me to go through and select them all and drag them over another 8 bars. The neat thing is you can just go over here and say, all right, I need to take this length of time and then make that happen twice, and everything else scoots over. Go to duplicate time, and it moves everything else out of the way for you. Same thing goes for delete time, for cut time, any of those things. Deleting time actually scoots everything back over the other direction. This is a huge, huge time saver. When I found out about that, I was going, man, I've probably wasted hundreds of hours. So, learn from my mistakes. Cool. So, obviously delete. Okay. Alt drag. This is kind of a cool feature. If you want to, say, make a copy of this, but you want to make it, say like duplicating it always makes another copy right next to it immediately. So you can't place it exactly where you want. And for instance, say you wanted this to play like every other. You wanted to play here and there. Well, that's kind of a pain because you can't just do it with duplicate. So if you hold down the option button when you click and drag it, it makes a copy. And then you can take that whole section, say like, say you want to make that happen over again. You can duplicate that once you've got a little pattern going. But that's, so that's a nice, easy way to manipulate your clips. And keep in mind, everything I'm doing here, we're doing with MIDI clips, but it's totally possible to do the very same stuff with audio clips. It's just that I can't just generate an audio clip out of thin air by just double-clicking in the empty space. So that's why we're working with these. Okay, so click and tab. Okay, this is another cool feature, and it allows you to combine the strengths of the session view with the I guess the organizational capabilities of the arrangement view. You can take something that you've been working on over here and say, man, I've got like 3 different lead segments that I want to put over there, and I want to put them in certain places. If you click on it and you hold your mouse button down and then hit the tab key, it's still in your mouse as you keep that mouse button down, and you just go over to the same channel that you were just coming from and just drop it. And then the very same clip that you just dragged over, including any automation that's built into it, any modulation, the stuff that you've already done to it over in session view comes with it. Now once it's over here, it's creating a copy. This doesn't change that. But you can end up copying them both ways. Like if you've done something over here, you go, man, that's beautiful. I need to keep that. You go click, tab, drop. So that was another one of those things when I kind of discovered it accidentally. I was like, seriously? I've been doing this? So yeah, the keyboard shortcuts are really what's going to save you the most time with this this program. And I've got a big like wallpaper that I can distribute to you guys that you can save as your desktop that has all of the most like common and useful Ableton Live shortcuts, basically just on there. So here we go. Split, consolidate, freeze. We talked about freeze already. Rename. Okay, yeah, this is pretty easy. So you want to rename a clip. Command R, Control R. You type in a name. Hit enter. That's rename. To split a clip, you go to wherever it is. Say you have something that's like, man, I like both parts of this, but I want it to be 2 different clips. You click somewhere like halfway in between it. Command or Control E turns it into 2. That's a split. And then you can also, once you've done that, basically the individual pieces of this will have, like, this will still have, if you're down in here, you see it actually still has the whole rest of the clip in it. It's just that it only is going to play about half of it. Here, actually, it's probably better to demonstrate that on this one here. So, see how this one here, it has, this one is selected, it plays from here, but all the notes are still there in its memory. So later on, I could say, you know, take this and drop it over here, and then I could expand it back out, and everything that was there before would still be there. But if you wanted to make that a separate clip, you would right-click and you go to Consolidate, and then that becomes the full length of the clip. All right. Let's see here. Adaptive grid. I think we talked a little bit about, you know, so you get your zoom levels here. The grid is these little points here. And as you zoom in, an adaptive grid actually gives you more grid points the closer zoomed in you are. That, I think, is the easiest way to do any of this stuff, because, you know, the closer in you get, generally speaking, the more detailed you're trying to get. I don't think there's a lot of purpose towards having a fixed grid, but some people like it that way. So I guess, you know, it's up to you to decide how you want to do it. But that applies whether you're talking about, you know, the actual arrangement view itself or individual clips. Either way, you can go in here and then you can change your adaptive grid to, you know, the different sizes, and then you can also choose whether you want it to be a fixed grid here. I usually go with narrow, because narrow it seems to be a pretty nice, it doesn't get too small to the point where it's like, if you do this, no, I mean the wrong one. So like, say I'm out here and if I go to narrowest, I feel like that those lines, when they come in at such small increments where it's like I barely move the mouse and I'm on the next one. Whereas in this one, it seems like the appropriate level. Again, it's by feel, but that's the one that seems most natural to me. And it is the default setting, so maybe there's something to be said for that. Okay, color coding stuff. This is more for organizational purposes than anything, but if you can right-click on pretty much almost anything in the whole program, you can change its color. That helps a lot when you're trying to organize and remember, you know, say you don't really necessarily want to give each one of these a different name. Like if you've got 3 or 4 different bass lines that are all played by the same bass instrument, they're all playing different notes, but you don't really have any specific name you want to give them. It's hard enough to come up with a name for your track, let alone the individual parts within it. You can just use color coding to keep them separate. Let's see here, grouping. So right now we're looking at channels. These are just individual channels, but this one is actually a group channel. If I expand this one out, there's actually 2 different channels within it. There's a drum rack, which is an instrument, and there's a percussion rack, which is another instrument, and we'll get more into those later. But the way that you can make things into a group is by selecting more than one of them. So you hold down the Shift key and get the second one selected, and then you can do Control or Command G, and that puts them into a group together. Now you can name the group whatever you want it to be. You can give it its own color code. You can route all of its audio differently, and you can even add effects to the group as a bus rather than adding the effects to these ones individually, or you can add effects to these ones individually and to the group as a whole. So a lot of very complex stuff you can do with that, and we'll get into some of the more neat implementations of that here in a little bit. Naming schemes. I think it's kind of important to have a coherent naming scheme for your various different pieces of your track. I've seen a lot of producers, especially when they first get going, where they just, every time they drag an instrument over here, you know, say they're starting off and you know, they're using everyone's favorite Native Instruments plugin, Massive, and they go, all right, I'm going to make a bass line, and I'm going to make a synth for a lead, and I'm gonna use Massive to make drums too. And then they end up with, you know, 3 or 4 different channels over here, and they haven't bothered to name them anything. And the problem with that is that you're not going to know what channel is what, and that gets really confusing when order of what you're seeing on the screen here, left to right or up to from top to bottom, isn't as obvious. Like for instance, when you're trying to route signal in between different channels, it's not as obvious where the signal is coming from or going to. When if you name them correctly, it's a lot easier to tell just from looking at the name exactly where that signal is coming from and where it's going to. So get in the habit of every time you add an instrument, just give it. It doesn't matter if it's just bass 1, bass 2. That's pretty much what all mine end up being called anyway. Is bass 1, bass 2. You know, lead 1, lead 2, drums, percussion, samples. Doesn't have to be fancy. Just has to be, you know, something that is easy for you to understand and short enough that it fits into a small space on the screen. Because the more space it takes up, the more likely that it's going to end up scrolling off the end of the screen before you can even tell what you're trying to read. Okay. Over here, show high detail view. This is probably going to be very useful in this session because we are so crammed on this. I'm using for those of you who aren't in the classroom here today, I'm using an external TV monitor to display to the rest of the guys here in the class what I'm doing, and it's a 720p, which is a lot smaller than I'm usually used to working on, so everything's a little crammed. But one of the nice things is, even if you are stuck on a small screen resolution, you can utilize some keyboard shortcuts that will help you utilize that space quickly and efficiently. On the Mac, it's Command Option L. On the PC, I would imagine it would be Control Alt L, but on here, what that does is it just shows and hides this section down here. And if you see, this is the info view, by the way, and it's basically whatever you hover your mouse over, it changes the description to tell you what that thing is. So it's telling me that little button there is the Show High Detail view, and I'm using the keyboard shortcut that it describes there to you know, give me more room to work around. And this is nice because if you've already dialed in all your sound design stuff, you've already done all of the modulation down here, and you just want to see a bunch of clips, you can just be in that view, and then you're good. Same thing goes for if you're over an arrangement view and you're, man, like I need to be able to see both my drum track and my bass track and even the vocals. I need to be able to see all three of them at once. Boom. Get that out of the way. So, browser layouts and the groove pool. Okay, yeah, so these are okay, we just talked about the expand collapse buttons. This is the browser. This is where all the stuff that you're going to put into your project is going to come from usually. So you've got sounds that come with live, you've got drums that come with live, instruments that come with live, audio and MIDI effects that come with live, and if you have Ableton Live Suite, which I highly, highly recommend if you're going to be serious about production. It comes with Max for Live, which is a really cool program that we have no time to talk about today, but I hope you get a chance to get into it. Third-party plugins, individual clips. You know, a lot of these are going to be ones that you've saved from your own archive. Things that you, oh man, I just love that little segment right there, just that little sample from, you know, that Easy E track or whatever. You want to be able to drop it in, you just have it in here and as a sort of a shortcut, and you can drop it whenever you feel like it. And then this is more of a sample area where this has got sort of just a, I mean, that's not even remotely all the samples I have, and I'm not sure exactly why it's only showing these precise ones. Probably these are the ones that I've worked on recently. But yeah, those are categories. These are places down here. These are your installed Ableton Live packs. You get your core library from Live. They give you a lot of the stuff that's in here as basically just like bonuses. You can go in here and find all kinds of samples, just crazy drum kits that emulate all different kinds of classics. I mean, you can get this. This is an 80. I'm sorry, that's a 606. This is an 808 kit. That sounds so much like an actual original 808 kit from back in the day when, you know, people first started making the hip hop sounds. It's uncanny, and all like all these different sounds are all coming from that same you know, that same team that got together and decided, you know, we're going to make our own modern software version of this, so you don't have to go out and try to find yourself a used 808 that's going to cost you $5,000 or whatever they go for these days. You know, you have it right here, and so that's pretty cool. And what's really neat about some of these is that they're actually synthesizing the sounds the same way that the original drum machine did. Instead of using like a sample of the sound, they're actually saying, okay, a synthesizer can make a drum sound. You know, we'll get more into that kind of stuff in a different class, but that's the reason that's cool is that synthesized drum sounds are much cleaner. You can stretch them out. you can compress them, you can distort them a lot more ways before they start sounding like they've got artifacts in them from stretching and warping and things like that. Again, more that we can cover on that in another tutorial session. But I think it's pretty cool that they include a lot of that stuff in live. Used to be a lot more expensive to be a producer than it is today. So. Let's see here. The browser layout. Okay, I gotta finish talking about this stuff. User library. This is going to be all of your like individual racks. If you've designed a rack that you just love the heck out of, and you love the way that all of the stuff in that chain flows, and you just want to save it as your own, you can put it in your user library. Your current project. These are individual racks that are only going to apply to the one that you're working on right now. And the cool thing is you can even add a folder down here. If you've got like a favorite sample pack you love to go to all the time, you want to pull stuff from, for instance, I actually have a sample pack that we're going to use as our baseline sample pack for everything today. It's got basses and leads and effects and drum loops and drum hits and everything all in one. And it's actually a free sample pack that Prime Loops released recently. It's just a little over 2 gigs. I've got a zip file of it if you guys, if you guys that are here want to take home a copy. So what it's doing now is it's adding that that folder to my user library here. Right now it's actually indexing the files that are in there, so that's why you didn't see them all at first. But once it finishes indexing them, then they'll actually be searchable. So I could go up here and I could type in, I wanted a snare. That has all the snares that is currently indexed. All the ones that have the word snare in them. Now some of them don't have the word snare, so you might have to get a little creative and figure out exactly what your favorite loop shop likes to call their different drum sample types. Like let's see here, these guys, what do they call their drum hits? They call their kicks kick 01, kick 02. Everybody has different naming schemes for their stuff. It should be relatively uniform, but not always. So let's go back over here. Not looking fees, look at feel. All right. These are, this is Ableton Live preferences. So on the Mac you can do Command comma. I believe it's Control comma on the PC. You know what? On the PC it's probably something different because that's a universal Mac command that opens the preferences window for whatever Apple you're in. So here we've got a look and feel. These are the different tabs that I'm going to be talking about. Look and feel. These are different like zoom levels. Ooh. Now, of course, that's not readable, so I probably shouldn't zoom all the way that far out. But it can be, if I've got it zoomed in too far, and it's like, man, this is totally unusable. I can't use this for anything. I could zoom it out a little bit. Like I could still read this. That's actually quite a bit better than it was before, and I'm actually getting something a lot closer to like a higher screen resolution than what this monitor is actually capable of. Now all I got to do is just readjust this. Oh, there we go. That's way more comfortable. Man, I don't know why I didn't do that earlier. So again, back to the preferences here. We can change the color palette. This is somewhat new to Ableton Live 9. You can change the default clip colors. These are the different skins that you can change the brightness level. Like if you want to be working late at night and you don't want it to hurt your eyes, you can change the brightness. You can change the color intensity. You can change the hue of the color. And these are all just within the same theme. Like you can change all. There's like almost too many different ways to customize this. Okay, maybe not too many, but yeah, it's very customizable. I'm trying to find a color that is actually easy on my eyes and probably visible for you guys online as well. How's that looking? Oh, you guys have your laptop shut. That's okay. All right. Okay, so let's see. Audio sample rate. So in here, you've got your whatever it is, the device that you're using to play the sound out of your system. Whether it's something like you're using like an internal audio routing software like Soundflower, or if you're actually using the device itself. This is like my my FireWire sound card. You could route through that. You can also route through your built-in output which, you know, on a MacBook, this is your just little headphone port here. A lot of different ways you can do it, and that's actually the way that I'll get the sound to start coming out of that speaker over there here in a little bit. I know you guys online won't be able to hear it, but guess it sucks to be you. Actually, it probably won't even sound that great because I don't have like that much stuff in here, so maybe it doesn't suck to be you. Sample rate. This is what your sound card is going to be capable of. Whatever you have selected here as your output device, if it supports different sample rates, which it should. If you're using a professional quality sound card, it will support various different sample rates. The one that's built into the MacBook Pro comes all the way up to 96 kilohertz. The FireWire card that I'm using over here actually outflanks pretty much all the other hardware I have, and it makes it so you can't even hear the sound anymore because it goes all the way up to 192 kilohertz, which is ridiculous. There's only one time that I ever do that, and that's when I'm recording a sample that I want to stretch out really long, and then I want to avoid as much as possible any of the artifacting that comes along with that. So, but what you're doing here is just picking the quality level, and it's not quite right to call it the quality level. It's kind of this is the number of times per second the computer is taking a sample of the wave position of that audio, and it's making an approximation of that wave digitally. Obviously, an analog sound comes into the system as you know, completely analog. There's no stepping to it at all. When you have a digital system, what it's doing is it's going and taking like little points on a curve, and then it says, okay, well, the general shape of this curve looks like about this, so I'm going to approximate everything in between there. The lower numbers means it takes fewer of those points on the curve. And if you've done anything in you know, calculus and that kind of stuff, you'll know that the more points you have on a curve, the more accuracy you can get to the actual real data. And that's why the higher sample rates are better if you can use them. The thing is, a lot of sample packs come in 44.1, which is, you know, that's good. That's what is considered CD quality. And if you download something in a 24-bit depth instead of 16-bit depth, most CDs are at 16:44.1. If you download something that's in a 44.1, that's actually decent enough quality that I consider it, you know, good enough to play out live, even on a real big system. And so no problem at all with using 44.1. If you want to go a little higher, just understand that it's not going to help you to do that. But if you have other samples in your set that are lower bit rate, because it's going to have to resample them, and then you're just going to end up with kind of a muddled mix of different sample rates. So, you know, keep that in mind. If you're making something completely from scratch, recording it all at home, using your own set of microphones, your own sound card, recording all your own percussion sounds by tapping on a desk and kicking the box under your desk, whatever, you know, you want to make your own stuff, you sample whatever rate you want to, and then you can make it sound really awesome. But again, there's a diminishing level of returns on that. You know, the higher sample rates you get to, the fewer people are going to care. All right, so buffer size. This is the amount of the number of samples that the computer will load into the buffer before it plays them out. The more buffer size you apply, the more latency that you're going to get. That means that the more time in between the time the computer tells the sound to play and the time that it actually comes out of your speakers. So the more time that you add in there, the longer that's going to be, so it can make it a little bit harder to get your timing exactly right, especially if you're trying to play along with it live. But the more buffer you have, generally speaking, you get a little bit more forgiveness if your CPU load fluctuates as it's playing the track. There's some parts of the track where it's not going to have hardly any load at all, and there's other parts where all of a sudden a bunch of effects start kicking in, the CPU load bumps up a bunch, and then that's where the having that buffer in there of, you know, the 128 is the default, but you know, you might want to go up to 256. I generally keep it in the I don't know if this is just me being anal retentive or not, but I always go with like divisible by 8 numbers. I'm a nerd, okay, get over it. All right, so buffer size, driver error compensation. So this is a way for you, if you've got a sound card that has a little bit of latency error that it's adding to the mix, you can actually compensate for that using this little slider here. And what's happening there is, you know, say if I made this 256 and that changes this number down here, so I can try to get this as close to 0 as possible. But if I say if I go back to 128, see how that went back down. So I go, all right, I'm gonna move that back up a little bit. I usually just try to get that number as close to 0 as possible. Again, I'm not sure if that makes me just really anal attentive or what. But all right, so MIDI sync. This is going to be a lot more important for when you're actually using MIDI controllers, which we'll get to at the end of this, but we'll skip that for now. In the file folder, you save your current set as default. So say you've designed a really cool production template, or you take the template that I'll give you guys today and you want to make that your default so that whenever you load up live with a brand new project, it shows you all of that from the get-go. Oops. You load up whatever that is, and then you go in here and you click save, and then that turns that into your default mode. If you clear it, it goes back to what it was from the factory. Keep in mind that if you design a template yourself and then you're like, man, I love this, and you hit save, it doesn't actually save that anywhere but an obscure little file somewhere that if it happens to get overwritten accidentally by you hitting the clear button, or you accidentally overwrite it by saving another set over the top of it as a default, you lose all of that. So what I usually recommend for templates is actually saving the template as its own file and then going in and saving it as the default. That way you can have different versions of your template, different types of templates that you want for different purposes. I have a template that I use for live performance and a template that I use for production. So and different versions of them even, so it's a good idea to keep them separate. Let's see here. See, if you install a plugin while Ableton Live is running, hit rescan, and it'll go through all of your system's folders and find any new plugins that have been installed since the last time, and then make them show in the browser over here. Let's see here. This tells the system how you want it to record. When you record files, do you want it to record as WAV or AIF? The reason I choose AIF if you have this option on your Mac is because you can add metadata to AIF files. WAV files don't support metadata, so you can't tag them. You can't put BPM information into them or key information and other things like that. Nice thing about, I pretty much have saved my entire live music performance library as lossless AIF files because I can still encode all the title, artist, label, release date, BPM, key. All that stuff can actually be encoded into the file itself, rather than having to keep a separate database of all that information, and it makes it a lot easier for transferring it to a different computer or something. All that information comes with it. So that's the only reason. There's nothing technically different between these two, and nothing makes them superior in terms of sound quality. It's just that AIF has a little more flexibility for that purpose. Bit depth is the amount of headroom you get in terms of quietness to loudness. A 24-bit depth will give you a lot more ability to go quieter and still retain the same level of clarity, and the ability to go louder and still maintain the same level of clarity. That's why a lot of times people used to complain a lot that CDs just didn't sound the same as records, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that they were having to do some pretty serious compression in the mastering studio to get the sounds. To the quiet sounds, they had to bring them up a little bit, and the loud sounds, they had to bring them down a little bit to get them to fit into that 16-bit depth space, and that makes it obviously the works that were very moving, that had these big crescendos, and then they would get quiet and things like that. They just didn't sound the same on CDs because they had to squash them to get them to fit in there. Nowadays, you can make a lossless file that goes all the way up to 32-bit depth, which is just ridiculous. The file size in this gets like out of control. But 24-bit depth is so far beyond where almost anyone needs to go these days that there's almost no point in going anywhere else beyond that. You get a 24-bit depth file even with a 44:1 sample rate, and it'll sound, in my opinion, just as good as the vinyl in terms of the subtleties of it. And the really cool part about it is you don't get any crackling. The little bits of the analog that make the record kind of an outdated format. Every time you play it, it gets a little bit worse, that kind of stuff. So this is the reason why people hated the CD at first. There's no reason now to hate digital audio formats. All right, count in. This is how many bars the metronome will tick off, but when you hit the record button before it actually starts recording. This is like your drummer going 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 1 bar, assuming you're doing a 4/4 time signature. You can also have them go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or all the way on up. usually I think a 1 bar counting is good, especially if you're going to be recording instruments and you want to give yourself time between when you hit the record button and you get your hands over to the instrument and get them all situated. So exclusives. This is where you can decide whether you want to have, okay, so if you have your ARM exclusive turned on, that means you can only have one track armed at once. If you click on one, it unarms the others. See? But you can turn that off, and now you can have 2 tracks armed at once if you wanted to. Not a lot of reason to have that in terms of the arming. I do feel that it is a good feature to have turned on if you're going to be using the solo, because you can solo 1 track and you can solo 2. Oops, I'm sorry. I don't know why that. Maybe that's the opposite of what I was expecting. Yeah, okay. So leave that one turned off apparently. You can solo more than 1 track at once. It's also possible to get around that setting, whatever your default is, by just holding down the I believe it's the Option key. Maybe it's the Command key. Yeah, there we go. It's the Command key on the Mac, and it'll be Control on the PC. So again, just knowing these keyboard shortcuts and where all this stuff is the most important part to making sure that when you do go decide that you're going to sit down and make a track, you don't run into a problem and go, gosh, now I got to go search for hours trying to find how to do this thing. All right, and where was I? Arming. Okay, let's see. Remember all the stuff that's, some of this stuff is not exactly things that we need to talk about. This is kind of a good thing you want to know in advance. If you're going to be DJing live with Ableton Live, when I say DJing, I mean actually playing other people's tracks or playing your own tracks, but they're already rendered full tracks. You're probably going to want to turn on the auto warp long samples feature so that when you bring in a full track into one of these things, it actually does analysis on the full length sample and then says, I think the BPM is about this and these are where the downbeats are. It does all that analysis for you in a similar method to the way that that Native Instruments Tractor does track analysis, Virtual DJ, some of those other programs like that. This one is a little bit different in the sense that you can actually change what is the perceived tempo at different parts of the track, and so you can use that to correct a track that was originally had changes in its tempo, or you can use it to modulate the tempo of a track that had a steady tempo to begin with. So that does set it apart a little bit from the other software out there. I would say, when you're using this for producing, auto warping long samples, you don't want to have that turned on, because if every time you drag in a sample and it's longer than whatever it arbitrarily thinks is a long sample, then it's going to put it in warp mode. And a lot of times, if you're putting samples into your track as little bits of a production that you're doing, you don't necessarily want to warp them. So I leave that turned off for production purposes. Default warp mode, if you're designing a bunch of beats, you probably want to leave it in beats. If you're designing tones, you probably want to leave it in tones. Textures, pretty much those are named very appropriately for how you want, like what type of sound you're trying to process with the warping. Did I say already that warping is the way that you change the tempo? I can't remember if I'd said that already, but it's basically a way that you take an audio file and change whether it's playing fast or slow. You can stretch it or scrunch it. I don't know what the opposite of stretch is. Because compress is actually a different word in audio terminology. So, all right, repitching. This is actually basically the same way that if you were like on I don't know if you guys are familiar with an actual old school turntable, but the way that like the Technics 1200s, the classic DJ turntable, the wheels of steel, they have a pitch fader on them. They call it a pitch fader because it actually does change the pitch of the audio that's coming out. If you slow that record down, it actually gets lower in pitch, and if you speed it up, it starts sounding like a chipmunk. And so that's kind of a pain in the ass about records, because you can't ever really rely on them being the right pitch if you change the tempo a little bit. It's cool if you're trying to emulate that sound, and some people do try to do that with some of their live sets. I've actually heard some DJs use this almost exclusively, and it does really emulate that sort of old school feel. It just depends on what kind of sort of aesthetic you're going for, and it's, again, personal choice. Complex is a mode that tries to take the best of all these different worlds and puts it together. If it happens to be a drum loop that you're processing, it gets pretty good transient recovery, or not recovery, but it does pretty good separation of the transients from the other sounds. Transients are the quick, fast sounds that come and go very quickly. It also does a pretty good job of preserving the textures of especially like complex bass tones and synths. Most importantly, this is probably the best one that I've found for processing vocals. It's either between this one or Complex Pro, but they don't offer that one as one of the default warp modes. It is selectable on a per clip basis, per sample basis, but we'll get more of that later. All right. Man, I feel like, oh man, I'm totally overshooting my time on this thing. I hope you guys weren't planning on being done with this really soon. All right. And if anybody does need to go, by the way, like I said, this whole thing is going to be recorded and it's going to be online. So if if for some reason then you're like, man, this is taking forever, I just want to watch this later, you can. I will totally not be offended. I might cry a little bit inside, but all right. Okay, yeah. Time to get over to the CPU. Turn your multi-core support on. If you have a multi-core processor on your computer, which it's pretty easy to figure out. If you have a Mac, you just go up here about this Mac, if it's any of the Intel Core series, it should. If it's like the Duo series, the Core 2 Duos, those were dual core. They were a different architecture, so they're a lot slower, but they're still dual core. Any of these ones are. You can get more information here, and you can actually tell exactly how many cores it has if you want to go to the the very specifics in the system report. But I don't think we have a lot of time to get into that. But it's important to have that turned on because Live has the ability to prioritize the different parts of its tasks and actually separate them into the different parts of your processor. And it's not as good as some other programs that I've used that had really good multi-core support. I think it's kind of something that they've added at a later date, and they need to put a little more work into it. It's stable. I will say that it's stable, that it doesn't make things worse, but I think it could use a little more work, but it's better than not having it turned on by a long shot. So please turn that on if you have that feature available. You guys ready to actually get into the instruments? I'm going to go through, and if you're following along with me in Live, you might notice that I may skip one or two of the instruments or effects, and it's not because they're not cool or not important. It's that this thing's going long enough as it is. There's some that I don't even mention in the outline here, and those are the ones that I personally don't use a lot. So I don't feel like I have the right level of expertise to be able to say this is what this is and what it does and how to use it. So I'll try to only talk about the stuff that I feel I have the competency to actually give you some cool advice for. So without further ado, Ableton Live instruments. We will go in and actually look at the ones that come with Live. Some of these, in fact, a good number of them, don't come with the basic versions of Ableton Live. This is one of the big reasons why I think Ableton Live Suite is a fantastic investment. If you're in any way involved in an educational pursuit, if you're a part-time student or any of that kind of stuff, even if I get my certification and become an Ableton Live certified instructor, and then you can say you're one of my students, any of those things count. You can get education discounts that end up chopping like half the price off of Ableton Live Suite, which is, it's a fantastic deal as it is. If you get the education discount, it's stupid good. So, again, highly recommend getting the Ableton Live Suite. If not for the instruments that the extra instruments that come in here, because you can still use third-party plugins that accomplish some of the same stuff. It's for Max for Live. Again, I don't have enough time to talk about it today, but look into it. If you have a little bit of time, it is fantastic. The stuff you can do with that is just out of this world. Operator. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. I put that in the wrong spot. I should mention that the way I've designed these things in this template is actually as multiple sounds. You can have a bass instrument as one channel that has different voices. In music, they call them timbres. It's actually spelled more like timbre, T-I-M-B-R-E, but the snobby music majors will turn their nose up at you if you if you call it a timbre. So what you do is, with these ones here, you can actually add individual sounds into this rack so that as you send one set of MIDI notes in through here, it's actually playing those notes into each one of these chains separately, and all of these different versions of different instruments will actually play the same set of notes together as a unit. You might consider it like a trio or a quartet or something like that. The timing is perfect, and it works. Their sound works really well together. And that's the way I've designed this whole thing, is to not only to give you the ability to use different instruments together, but the stuff that comes after them in the chain is actually designed to bring their sounds together and really make them one sound. So let's start off with the sub bass, because that's everyone's favorite thing to start with these days. Operator has a fantastic set of presets. There's sub basses in here. I'm just going to go and pick one. I'm dropping it here where it says drop instrument here. Go figure. Now, but that's attached to this bass 1 _ S. I put S for sub bass. A and B, of course, are for voices A and B. So here is this sine. Sine wave is basically just this again, as I talked about before, a very clean analog oscillation back and forth. That's actually what these things are called. They're called oscillators. The different voices in a synth are the thing that actually creates the sound is called an oscillator. So that's, if you hear me talking about that, that's what that is. Operator is primarily a frequency modulated synthesizer. What that means is each one of these different oscillators can be used to create a sound, but you can also use the oscillation to cause modulation on the other oscillators. And that creates some really cool possibilities. And the complexity that can come out of these things is so mind-boggling. That I believe the very first frequency modulated synthesizer that came out back in the 80s was like a tremendous hit. It was more popular than any of the other synthesizers before, and it just became instantly like a favorite in almost all forms of pop and funk and pretty much everything that people were doing at that point in time, because it was the only thing that could produce that varying of different ranges of sounds. What you can do with frequency modulated synthesis is make things from all the way that sound from something so serene and elegant as like almost something that sounds like a violin, all the way to something that sounds like a bell, something that sounds like underwater rocks crushing into each other. Almost any sound you can make with this, because of the fact that stacking multiple different oscillators on top of each other, using them to modulate each other, creates these such complex waveforms that you don't really hear them anywhere except for in real life, like in nature. There's still a little bit of a digital quality to it, because at some point it does actually the waveform does actually start repeating itself, and that's when you hear a sound that sounds kind of artificial. It usually is a sign that you're hearing a little bit of the parts of that sound that end up repeating on top of each other, because real sound in nature has nothing at all that repeats itself other than maybe the frequency. But let's see. I wonder if the sound's actually going to work in here. You guys, I've got my output setting over to the amplifier over there. So hypothetically, if I turn my, there we go. Now, obviously, that is not a sub. that is definitely not a sub. What I'm going to do though is right now, part of the reason why it's not a sub is because I'm playing the notes in a higher part of the range. That is, again, I'm still playing on my computer keyboard here, so it's totally not going to sound melodic at all. But you can use the Z and X keys on your computer keyboard if you happen to be in that mode to change the octave you're playing in. So I'm going to hit X a couple times, jump up a couple octaves, hit Z a couple times, down a few octaves. Yeah, that's a nice, I mean, if that were an actual woofer over there, not a guitar amplifier, that would have a pretty nice little hit you in the chest kind of buzz to it. But that's how you get your first sound in there. And then you can, I mean, this is a whole other class that we could run on how to use operator. But for now, let's just say, it's safe to say that that's a good thing to put in as a sub. Use one of their sub presets, maybe do a little bit of tweaking around with it, but at first when you're getting used to this stuff, don't get too into the tweaking because you will lose thousands of hours of your life tweaking things. The thing is that Ableton, the people that work at Ableton, the people that make this software, they are truly experts in their field, and they know their shit. Sorry, my French. Their presets are very, very good. You might need to change them a little bit to make them fit your needs, but there's very few times where you actually have to take one of Ableton's built-in instruments and start making a sound from scratch, unless you just feel like you need to get a little bit of that creativity out of your system. So, and that has its place too. All right, so now we've added a sub bass. Let's add a part A and a part B to it. Just for simplicity, I'm going to keep using operator, but I'm going to go into a different part of the basses and maybe pick like, there it is. Yep. Okay, so what's cool is you can take different, like, okay, so that's plucked, like a plucked sound, right? It sounds like an actual like bass guitar. You can take that sound and say you want that to be your A voice, and for the B you want to put in something that's a little more, sustained. That's kind of plucky too. What about something that's more? There we go. Might be a little on the heady side, but now what that does is we've now taken the three of those things and put them all together into one. All right. Now I play this note, it's going to play all three of those. Right? I can now use this sub crossover to determine how much of that signal I want to be played by the sub. What I'm doing here is this is a macro knob. This knob is controlling this frequency cutoff over here. So this will go up when I turn that knob up, and these other two voices actually have a similar filter on them where it's tied in with the left side of it. So as that knob gets turned up, they get, I don't know if you guys have ever seen one of these, this is an EQ display, and what's being shown here is the frequency range. These are usually your sub bass ranges here. This is where a lot of like your snares and some of your like actual bass notes are going to play. This up in here is where your leads are, and then this is the air or the like the sizzle that you'll hear. If you were to hear just that, it would sound like a totally broken transistor radio that just. But without that, music sounds totally flat, and so it's necessary for it to be there. It can get a little harsh, which is usually why I roll it off in the basses, because it's not important to have those gritty little bits coming through on the basses all the time. So why don't we see what that does? If I turn this up, almost all sub, almost all the other basses. And you can actually see this is the frequency response here. Each one of those peaks in there is one of the harmonic the overtones. That's the right word for it. Each one of those little peaks is an overtone. So when you see that many different overtones, and of course this one we're looking at, this is voice A, and that one by itself, it's actually, it doesn't have a lot of overtones. That's why you don't see that many in there. It's not a lot of harmonics to it. It's pretty much just a nice little bit of it's the sub bass, a lot of that, and then there's a little bit of the harmonics down in here, but pretty much all of it goes away until you hit this little area up here. That's the pluck. That's the part where it's like you hear that little pluck at the beginning of the bass sound. So that's how that works. And so yeah, you can look at the entire frequency of this whole channel together by going and looking at this guy. So you can still see that pluck coming through, but it's being distorted by the other pieces of the bass. And like, man, look at that sub bass down in there. That is bam, that is powerful. So that is how you'd want to have that set up. If the bass instrument that you're using here ends up being like or I should say, if the sub bass instrument is tuned to the same octave as the other ones by default, there's a lot of times you can go into the synth itself and change the default octave that it plays at. You can say, you know, have it set to, you know, -12 semitones, which is an octave. But a simple way to do that is to add a MIDI effect into the chain right before it to subtract 12 semitones. That's something we'll cover later in this tutorial. But I wanted to mention that to you because it can get frustrating when you're going, man, why is the sound not sounding fat enough? It's because the you know, your different instruments here are actually supposed to play in different octaves. There's you know, many different octaves here that you can play in, and you know, getting stuff to play in the different frequencies here and really shine with their own different voices requires having them tuned differently. So we'll get more into that, but this is the I mentioned before, there's a crossfade that goes between the A and B, so you can have a part of the song where this is all it's playing. It's got the sub and it's got the A voice put together. That's what this is here. It's giving you full signal strength on A and the sub. If we go to the other end of the spectrum, but it also doesn't have that plucky sound. At the middle, it has the best of all three. All right? So, yeah, we've covered operator now. I guess a good idea would be to get into some of the other instruments that are available here, just to kind of talk about them briefly. All right, analog. For what we were just doing with operator, operator is a very digital sounding synth. It sounds like a synth that was invented in the digital age. It sounds very chippy, very, you know, it can sound natural if you do a lot of work with it, but it lacks some of the analog warmth of some of the synthesizers that were designed in an era where they weren't using actual digital components. They were using vacuum tubes and, I don't know, rats on little running wheels or whatever. I don't know how they made a lot of that stuff work back then. I'm definitely not an electrician, but I do know that analog synths have a certain quality to them that makes them desirable. And what Ableton was smart enough to, they said, you know what, people want these things so bad that they're either going to, you know, spend money on our product, or they're going to go out and buy a physical analog synthesizer, and that's going to cost them $5,000, $10,000. They made a synth in here that is, for all intents and purposes, a lot of what you would ever need out of an analog synthesizer. In terms of the different sounds that it can make, it's probably a little bit more basic than an operator. You can make a lot more different sounds with an operator, stuff that's way more extreme, but the analog is going to sound a lot more warm, a lot more inviting, a lot more like the basses will be just a lot more full, I guess, is a good way of putting it. The highs tend to warble a little bit. It actually emulates a little bit of the analog imperfections in the original analog synthesizers, which is what a lot of people like when they talk about nostalgia for the old days. You know, when you hear good funk music like Parliament or something like that, you hear those synthesizers. A lot of what makes them sound so funky is that it wasn't perfect. And they've done a good job of making that happen with analog. So, you know, let's just say I want to replace that plucky bass. Actually, no, I'm going to replace that really crazy one because that one was just overpowering on the last one. Why don't I take an analog bass and drop that in there? And let's see. Ooh, I like that one a lot. See how that one almost has like sort of like an 80s kind of feel to it all of a sudden? I mean, we're not even listening to it on that great of a speaker. For those of you guys who aren't here in the classroom with us, it's a PV guitar practice amp. It's definitely not anything special. When I actually teach a sound design course, I'll probably bring a PA system so that it'll be a little more up to date. But all right, so let's keep on moving. Yeah, so did you guys feel like I did a fairly decent job of explaining what analog is and why you might want to use it from the other ones? Okay. All right, continuing on here. Okay, these are not synths, but instead they are the ability to play samples in a MIDI channel. So say you got a bass sample that you got from somewhere. Say it's from a sample pack, or maybe you're trying to do like an official remix for somebody, and you want to take that bass line that they used or that bass sample that's in the stems they sent you, and you want to have that, but you want to maybe add some effects to it or something. Instead of having to recreate it from scratch, you just put it in either a simpler or a sampler, and I'll show you the differences between them here in a sec. So I'm going to actually drag them onto its own channel, though, because I don't want to have it going through all that other stuff that's in that base channel there. I'm going to turn this off. So simpler, very, very basic. This one does come with the more basic versions of Live, and Sampler only comes with Live Suite, I believe. There's obviously still a ton of things you can do with this in its current state, but let me show you what's possible with it as it is, and then what becomes possible once you add the sampler functionality. So I'm just going to go into here, and I'm going to pull the bass one-shots. I'm going to go in here, and let's see. Now I'm having a hard time reading the screen. Now I'm remembering what the issue with that was. All right. There we go. I wanted a sound that didn't have a definitive beginning and end. And the reason for that is because if you have it set up so that, you know, say I'm playing this, it's actually pitch tracking right now, and because I'm like a couple octaves low, that's why it sounds all gross. All right, so that is obviously it stops playing when it hits the end of it. You can add. You can change the play position, like where it starts playing from. You can change the end position, where it ends at. You can also set it up to loop. What's cool is you can even like change. I believe there's a way to change the loop function. It may not be possible in Simpler. But basically, if you can also use the zooming functionality in this one the same way you do in some of the other ones. If you do a good job of being careful about where you pick your start and end points, generally the good strategy is to look for the zero crossing, which is where that waveform crosses that line in the middle. Try to pick a spot where it looks like it's going in the same direction at approximately the same like angle, and then you'll get a sound that will sound about the same when it loops from beginning to end, and it shouldn't have a definite. And this one's probably going to be difficult to get. There we go. Hear how that we pretty much gotten rid of that clickiness. Yeah, I mean, yeah, we could. Yeah. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than just that, but you know, we got rid of that clickiness by finding the right start and end points. Now, let's take this into the sampler mode, and I'll show you the real strengths of what make that such a cool tool. You can either go grab the sampler from the rack over here and drag it in and then put the same sample in, or there's a nice little thing where you can just switch it. Simpler goes to sampler. Doesn't look a lot different until you go, oh, check this out. Boom, there's like this whole area where you can expand it up here. There's all this stuff you can do with pitch and oscillation, filters, all kinds of modulation stuff. You can map the different MIDI functions into it. And this is, I think, part of one of the things that was that I thought was a good idea before. So you can have the loop be this portion. You know, basically what we were just playing with, where we had that nice little gritty sound that was playing that didn't sound like a loop too much, but we can have it still play from the beginning, right? But then there's also the ability to make it so that when it's playing back, it doesn't just sustain by playing as a loop over and over again. We can have it so that it goes back and forth. It's not as obvious because you probably can't see that exactly what that red line is doing each direction, but it's going back and forth. And if I were to make that further back out like this, you know, that can be something a little more pleasing. And you know, there's even more you can do with it. I believe that. Let's see, where is that? I think there's a way that you can actually change the the strength of the, like how much it's doing a little bit of a crossfade between them. There it is. So basically with this, turn that up, and then instead of playing that exact sound back, it's still playing a little bit of the other one too. So here, that's a lot cleaner, a lot more like a unified sound. I'm sorry, I really should have picked a better sounding. That one almost, that's got like a musicality to it. You'd want to use that because it just has that sort of, it's got some life to it. So that's one of the features of Sampler. Another feature of Sampler is that you've got this zone up here. So this is one sample that we're working with. This is Story E. We go back down in here and say there's another one. There's other, let's pick a couple other different E notes. There's this one, and that one, and maybe this one. I mean, there's all kinds of different sounds I can put in there. These are all sounds that you could have basically play. Right now they're going to play all at the same time. That's not really that useful, but you can use modulation to select between them. This becomes really useful later on when we're doing stuff with drums, but I'll show you. Watch this. In the selector mode, right now they're all set up to play at the same time, but if I were to go select them all, right-click out here and distribute the ranges equally, and then use this. Right. I'm just playing the same key over here, just playing a key, but as I move the source, it's playing the same note, but it's playing different samples. You can also use, I mean, this is a chain selector. This is a way to use like MIDI automation to change the sound that's being played, but you could also do like, this is kind of neat. If I were to go in here and then just change all these back to, I don't know, it's not going to let me do that now, is it? Oh, here we go. Nice. So if I were to go in, instead, I could use velocity modulation, where the harder I hit the key, the further that thing goes over here. Like, okay, so right now, the keyboard keys on my laptop don't have velocity sensitivity, but this pad here does. So this is something I was planning on covering later, but I'll get in here and I'll just add it in here so that I can show you this thing. It is a pitch modulator, and I'm going to add a couple octaves. All right, so the note I'm playing right now, I'm playing it soft. See how that note is hitting, like that orange line is hitting down there at the bottom. If I hit hard, it's way up at the top, and it tracks further down. I can take these guys and distribute ranges equally, and then maybe do a little bit of, like, I could lengthen them a little bit each direction and make sure that they have a little bit of sort of crossover between them by like going in here, and this is the actual adjustment for making it so one fades out and the other one fades in. Right? So by doing that, now I've actually got the ability to play depending on how hard I hit it. Now, obviously, this one, if I hit it really hard, it's playing nothing at all. So that gives you some really cool, like, just by giving some varying different instructions to your controller, all of a sudden you get way different sounds, even if it's just the same note. So that same principle applies in so many different places in live. Once you understand it here, it starts making sense everywhere else. So it's cool we covered it here. So there we go. That's the sampler, and that's, I think, one of the things that makes it a really, really powerful instrument. You want to know a lot about the sampler if you can. I mean, the stuff in here we don't even have time to get into. We're already so far over. I can't even. But just trust me that this is one of between this and Operator and Max for Live. It's totally worth having the Max for Live, or sorry, for Ableton Live suite. One shots. Okay, we talked about. All right, so we were doing one shot basses with the sampler. and the simpler. There's actually a way to do the very same thing with other types of sounds using like drum racks, and there's another thing called Impulse, which is similar to a drum rack, and it's actually what they used before they invented the drum rack for version 8 of Ableton Live. So if I drop Impulse in here, it's going to look like, oh, there's 8 buttons there. You can drop 8 different drum samples in there, and you can, you know, hit different notes, and it'll play the different pieces of it. You know, if I were to drop notes in here, it should play each one of them. And there's even ways that you can use Impulse to create, or the drum rack to create a default drum rack. As you drop that in there as one unit, it actually creates the entire drum set for you. So it's just an easy way to get all of that integrated into one thing. I don't want to spend a lot of time on Impulse because I don't ever use it. I honestly think it's kind of a waste of time unless you're wanting to have a really simple, low memory usage piece of your set that you want to use to drop individual samples into a live set as you're playing. Like you want to have this and you wanted to have it mapped out to little, like, you know, you're listening to Blendrix, you know, that kind of thing. You can, yeah. Never sample it. Or did you watch this video that I already made one of these? I totally made that joke in the last one. That's funny. Yeah, I was like, I really hope you don't ever use it for the air horn. If you do, please just walk in front of a bus. Yeah. Okay, so the alternative to the Impulse, what I think is a good thing to have as your drum sequencer, is a drum rack. And the reason for that is that, you know, it looks roughly the same, right? You know, except this is like a hybrid between the Impulse's ability to add some modulation to those drum samples and all of the crazy macro stuff you can do with it with an instrument rack. You can now do in a drum rack. Plus, down here you can add an in-out section, a returns and sends channel, like the ability to add individual amounts of different effects to the different pieces of the drum kit. So within a drum rack, you could theoretically make an entire track just inside a drum rack because it has that much ability to modulate and to add varying different levels of effects. It would be a very big pain in the ass to do it that way, and I don't recommend it, but it's possible. And because of that, I think that emphasizes how powerful it is. So what you would do here is typically what you just drop samples into these individual spots here. But what makes this way more powerful than just the Impulse by itself is, you know, that's what it looks like if you just drag it in there by itself. If you use something a little more like, you know, something you spent some time on, like say this, you've got a category for your kicks. This kick button, when you play that button, it's kick 1 by itself, and that only plays that one kick, as you can see it playing over here. When you play kick 2, it only plays kick 2. But the fact that the kicks are in this rack together means you can pass both of them through a kick compressor together. That has basically, by having them in this send and return this way, it's actually achieving what they call parallel compression automatically. Parallel compression means that part of the signal is going through dry and part of it's going through compressed. It's a very popular way of achieving a drum sound that's both good and loud, but also preserves some of the sort of original organic feel of a sound that does have some dynamic to it. So now, as if that part wasn't good enough, you can also have over here, this is a whole bank of different samples you could choose from for kicks 1 through, I put in here slots all the way up through 10. And then for each one of those, you've got a sampler, which you could turn into a sampler if you wanted to, but this basically is a sampler in that regard, where you're able to take this chain and map it to whatever you want. By changing that knob, it's changing the selection of which hi-hat is playing. So if you've got 10 different hi-hats that you like different hi-hat samples you like to use, and they're in this little section here, and you know you've got your open hats and your closed hats, by the way. So this is the open hat one, obviously. By turning that knob, this selector is changing, and so you're cycling through your favorite 10 different open hi-hat samples. Same thing with your 10 favorite close hat samples, your 10 favorite cymbals, your crashes and rides, your 10 favorite snares, 2 different types of snares. And the reason I put 2 different types in there is because it can sometimes be fun to layer different sounds in there. It's also nice to know that if you're going to have the song do like a certain tempo at one point and then you're going to drop into halftime, a lot of times a kick that works at 128 does not work at 64 beats per minute, or 140 doesn't work at 70, or any of those kind of things, because when you drop into halftime, a lot of times you want your kick to have a lot longer decay on it. It's going to sound less like a thump and more like a boom, So that's why I have those 2 different types of kicks in there, so you can pick different types for different parts of the song. So yeah, this as a drum rack is a weapon to be contended with. When you have this in here, you can put you don't have to put all your sample back. You probably won't have enough space even in this for your entire sample library, but if you go through and you pick your greatest hits, the ones that you feel like are your best samples that you could use for a track, you won't ever have a problem getting the right sound for your drums, because as you're sitting there, you can make the core rhythm. You can say, all right, I want a kick, snare, hat, 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 right? You can put all that in there, and then as it's playing in the background, you can go, okay, I like that rhythm, but I don't like those sounds. Tweak the knobs, get the right sounds in place, then just leave them, and then go on with your track. That right there will save you so much time. That is a trick I learned from Vespers, who I believe learned it from Il Gates. It's one of those things where it's like, this kind of stuff gets passed down from producer to producer, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, why isn't everyone doing this? So I hope you guys get a chance to work with this, because it's a really, really fun way to make drums, and it can also be fun if you're doing something, if you decide you want to actually do live production where you're having the MIDI clips playing live. You can use the knobs. You can be like, all right, I'm going to change up the kick, I'm going to do some different hats here, and by changing the clips that are playing and changing what's actually being played by those clips, you can make every set completely unique, not repeatable, because there's no way you'd be able to remember to do all those things in that order again. Whereas DJs, a lot of times they're just kind of going track to track. Hopefully they're doing more than just that, but this makes it so you can take it to a much higher level. So drum rack's done. Oh, not quite done. So we had the chain selector macros, the send and returns, and audio 2. I think it's important to mention over here, we talked about the send and return, which is this part down here, where you're taking these different parts up here, and whatever's up here, you have the option to send a portion of that signal through this chain down here. Now what is being done with that chain? In the kicks and the snares, it's actually going through a compressor that's built into this rack that's specifically designed to compress kicks, or in the snares, in the case of the snares, it's a snare compressor. But on the hats, it's actually sending the signal out of the rack, and it's sending it through the exciter return channel on the master out here, which is a saturation plugin. And it's pretty much just putting a little bit of sizzle on the highs, and you don't necessarily want to do that on your kick drum, unless you're making like happy hardcore, I guess. Yeah, hardstyle, or any of those derivatives. But it is, a lot of times you do want to put some saturation on your maybe somewhat on your snare, definitely on your hats and on your cymbals, because especially in some of the more complex, very frequency-filled music that we're making these days, it can be sometimes difficult to make an instrument truly have a sound that punches through the mix, and so adding some saturation on there gives it just that little bit of an edge that makes it pop a bit better. So that's what that does in there. So the way we achieve sending it out to the master's return, instead of having it go through the rack itself, is by changing the audio 2 here. And you've got these different, you can have it just go straight to the rack output here, or you can have it go to any of these different return channels, and I have it going to the exciter. So there was one more thing that had to do with these. Okay, the choke groups. So if you're a drummer that's playing like on a hi-hat, if you guys are familiar with drum sets, but they have like this set of cymbals that are basically back to back like this, and as you play the open hat, it's open like this, and you go, and then you can press down on the foot pedal and it brings the two of them together, and as soon as you do that, it tightens it up, and if you hit it right again at that point, that sort of opens, loose kind of sound goes away right away. And there's a lot of drum stuff where basically as soon as you hit it again, that first sound isn't going to be playing anymore, and you don't want it to be playing anymore. And so, and even sometimes where there are different pieces of the drum where you want them to have distinctly separate portions of the mix that they're playing in, if they're never going to play at the same time, you put them in the same choke group so that when the first one is eclipsed by the second one, like when the first one's still playing like an open hat, and then the second one comes along and plays on top of it, it actually cuts off the first one. So it's just like playing an open hat and going, you know? Yeah, that's what's really, and then there's 16 different choke groups that you can put these into. So, you know, up to 16 different pieces of your drum kit that you can have, so, say that, you know, this piece and that piece and that piece, any of them that comes in while any of the other ones are playing, it's going to silence the other ones. So that's, you know, they ought to call them like choke, no, they shouldn't call them choke families. That sounds kind of Manson-ish. It sounded better. No, it didn't sound better in my head. All right. I'm gonna try to speed up a little bit on some of this stuff, guys, because I feel like I'm taking way too much time. We've actually covered the instrument rack already because we've already looked at when we were doing the stuff with the bass. The instrument rack is this. I've just renamed it and given it a name that makes it so you can easily recall it later. And these individual pieces of the instrument rack and all of the macro knobs that can be used to control any of the elements of any of these things in here. All you got to do is you find something that you say, man, I need to modulate that, but I don't want to go all the way over here to find that knob to move it. You know, you right-click on it, map to a macro number, and then you can come back out here, move that around, and it's actually moving that knob.
You can do that.
Oh yeah, yeah. You can take a different knob and map it to the same macro knob. Now, right now they're moving at exactly the same rate in the same direction. I can go into map mode here, and I can go in here and I can change this. So right now they are set up to, what are those? These are these ones, guys. So I'm going to actually have this one go in the opposite direction a little bit. See how that's changing over there? I don't know how obvious it is where that's happening. It's happening right here. So that's, you know, and you can do that with anything you end up macroing to the knob here. And I forget the exact number of things you can end up macroing to the same knob, but I think it is a multiple of 8, and I'm thinking it's like 16 or 32 or something like that. It's a lot. Let's get I'll put it this way: I've never reached that limit. And even if you did, there's ways to take Max for Live and drop it in there and add even more. So. Yeah, it's like the silent killer with this software is the fact that you totally have no idea when you've just spent an entire night. Like I've sometimes I've sat down and worked on a track for a little bit, and I'm like, okay, cool. I'll work on this for like another hour, and then I'll get some dinner. The next time I look at my watch, it's 6 a.m. and I gotta go to work. I'm like, what? So that's kind of the danger of this, and I think that this is something we aren't really talking about in this series, but I do at some point want to get into possibly a different series where we talk about time management techniques and maybe some like ways to trick yourself into being organized about stuff. So, but that's something to keep in mind. Okay, you can unmap things from the macros if you don't want them actually mapped to it. Okay, so. Here we go again. So we just and we already talked about this, but I forgot to mention. I ended up kind of giving the bass that we made the hybrid bass. I called it a Franken-synth because it's kind of little bits and pieces of different synthesizers put together, taking the best of each and accentuating it. So you know, you can call it whatever you want. I just thought it was kind of a cute name for it. Third-party plugins. I'm not going to do this because we've already spent so much time on it. Massive is a big one. I know that one like the back of my hand. If you guys ever want to know anything about Massive, I can show you all kinds of stuff like it. And one of the things that's most important to know about it is that when everybody talks a bunch of shit about it, again, pardon my French, it's, you know, they say, oh, it only makes the same sounds. It only makes the same sounds if you download the same sample packs or not sample packs, same preset packs that everybody else does, and then don't actually tweak them at all. Massive is capable of making almost any sound that you can imagine if you put the right amount of work into it and you put the right types of effects on it after its initial signal. So, you know, people love to hate that synth, but it is very, very powerful, and it actually has a fairly, you know, reasonable learning curve. I think they did a very good job of balancing the, you know, amount of functionality that it has with the way that you can pick it up pretty easily. Yeah, it is. It's more user-friendly than a lot of synths. I mean, it's not as user-friendly as some, but I think that there would be a trade-off. They would have to give up some of their functionality if they were going to try to make it more user-friendly. So, all right. I do actually run private audio lessons, very cheap, $20 an hour. If you guys ever want to learn anything specifically, I'd be happy to show you any of this stuff, and you know, you can find all that information in the same place where you got the Google Hangout instructions. All right, audio effects. Let's just go through and take a look at each one of these. I don't think we're gonna. I really don't want to spend enough time actually demonstrating what all of them do individually, but let me show you what all of them are. So you've got your auto pan. This is something that basically puts into motion a LFO, a low frequency oscillator. What it does is it changes a certain parameter in a certain pattern on a certain frequency, and in this case, what it's doing is it's taking the stereo position of the signal that's coming into it and moving that stereo position around at a certain pattern. So it's making it kind of pass back and forth between left and right. Now this is the original signal. There's another thing later on that does this with that does it with a delay, where it makes the delay kind of bounce back and forth. That's like an echo, versus this is the original signal. There's also a way that you can take AutoPan and do it like a kind of a hackish way of making a sort of a poor man's sidechain compression for if you want to make your bass synth kind of throb the way that it does in between kick drums. This is, again, if you're making dance music, I don't know how many people out there that might be watching this that are making other styles of music, but sidechain compression is very big if you want the kick drum to be able to come through the mix very cleanly and clearly, even when you still have a bass note that's playing at the same time, especially if you've got a sub bass that's in there. Sub bass and kick drum occupy a lot of the same frequency range, and what you're doing with a sidechain compression on that is you're trying to get the kick drum to cause the bass to get out of the way just for a second, to let it to come through, and then when it fades away, the bass comes back again. And there's a way to use the auto pan by I think what you end up doing is I'm not going to feed any signal through it here or anything, but you've got your mount, you turn up here, and I think what you end up doing is you turn your phase, you turn your phase to where it's all in sync like that, and what that's doing is causing it to completely fade in and out at a certain shape. And what you would typically do for that style of you know, where you want it to go, you know, where the kick's coming in, boom, 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 and the bass is going wah, 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 in between. You want to just kind of sound like it's coming. It gets cut off shortly and then rises back up. So usually you want to give it like, let's see the shape. Not that one. Maybe it's this one. Please, no. Dang it. How do we do that? Let's get back into this. All right, so there's an effect called beat repeat. This is essentially a glitch effect. What it's doing is you drop it in there, and you can modulate different parameters of it, and as the sound comes through it, at some point during when that sound is playing, you can randomize when that point is and for how long and how much. It basically takes that sound that's playing and ends up stuttering it back on itself. And again, you can automate the different parts of that. You can have it automate to turn it on and off. You can automate it so that it is basically glitching everything, or that it only glitches things occasionally. Lots of different presets even to play with it to try to, you know, see how that plays in. That is similar in some senses, at least in my opinion, to the gate effect, because a gate can be used for glitchiness, but I found that it is much easier, at least for me anyway, to make a gate give me much more granular control over exactly what glitches, when, and how much. And I oftentimes don't end up getting things to repeat very much. It's mostly just kind of getting the audio to cut out in very precise increments so that it's almost stuttering. And you can use different elements of the system to control when the gate is turned on and off. So that's just essentially, the gate is when it's on, it's blocking audio, and when the gate is off, it's allowing it to come through. So by setting the there's your attack and your hold and release. Those allow you to choose how long you want that gate to apply before it lets go and allows the audio to start coming through again. So yeah, it is. There's a lot of things that are like somewhat different in Live 9. I think overall Live 9 is a vast improvement over 8, and we haven't even gotten to the main reasons I think that is the case. Okay, chorus. This is an effect that, I don't know if you're familiar with what a chorus does, like as a guitar pedal. I'm a guitarist. I've been playing guitar since I was 16. But what it ends up doing is it takes your original signal, splits it up, and then takes the individual pieces that it's splitting off from there. You can have it split, 1 or 2 or 8, or there's lots of different voices you can get. But each voice, it ends up detuning just slightly. And the reason they call it chorus is because it ends up sounding like an entire choir. And the reason a choir sounds big and full is because they're not all hitting exactly the same note. They're all hitting very slightly different notes, and they're kind of moving around a little bit. It's sort of that analog nature that we were talking about earlier, where the slightest of imperfections actually makes things better. And so that the chorus, if you add just a little bit of it, just adds some shimmeriness, some fullness to a lot of sounds, and it's a great thing to put on a lot of different sounds. Try it on different things, but yeah, we won't get too much into it. It's a simple effect, but it does a very effective job. No pun intended. Compressor, glue compressor, and limiter. A compressor and a limiter are basically two sides of the same coin. I'm going to drag this over here so we can look at it. Apart from all the other ones that are elsewhere in the system here. I want to be in the other view. There we go. So what a compressor is doing is I think I mentioned this before. It basically takes your quietest sounds and allows you to make them louder by bringing your louder sounds down a notch. And what you're doing here is you're saying, okay, so at what point, at what decibel level am I going to start making the loud sounds quieter? So am I going to say that every sound that comes through here, am I going to turn it down? Well, that's this. If it's going to be only the very loudest of the loudest sounds are going to get compressed, that's this. That's barely even a compressor at all. Usually you have something that's kind of in the middle somewhere, and it's something where your loudest sounds are getting compressed a little bit. This is a generic compressor. This would make almost anything sound a little better. You start cranking up your ratio. This is where you would get into where you're talking about, like, where you sidechain this to the kick drum in your drum rack and set that up so that this becomes, and you'd probably turn your threshold down a little bit. Like something like this is more like what you would use to compress your bass lines with a kick drum signal, because you'd want pretty much any time that that bass is playing and that the kick drum starts coming through, you want most of that bass to be getting a lot quieter, or you want most of it to be getting quieter. And when you say quieter, you mean by a pretty good amount. This is like how much quieter and how much of it do you want to get quieter. Make sense? All right, yeah, probably not a lot, but this took me a lot of experimenting to really get a feel for it. The attack is how quickly this reacts to the incoming signal. So, if a really loud sound comes through at the beginning and you've got it turned up pretty high, that loud sound is going to come through, and then eventually it's going to go, oh shit, that's loud, it's going to turn it down. Or you can have it turned way down so that basically as soon as sound starts coming through, it's already affecting it right away. And that's where most people end up keeping their compressors, although there are exceptions to that rule as well. This is a neat feature. This is parallel compression. You can turn this down, and so that basically you've got whatever signal is coming through here, half of it's getting compressed, half of it's not. And that gives a very full sound. That is, I definitely recommend experimenting with and perfecting that. Out of any of the techniques, that's one of the ones that gives you one of the most distinguishing. It's one of the most distinguishing characteristics between a beginner producer and someone who actually has experience doing it. It's somebody who understands the right amount of compression and the right mixture of effects on their different sounds. So. Let's see. Okay, so that was a compressor. Basically, a limiter is where it's essentially it's a compressor, but it's doing it on everything. So instead of having, of course, it would be usually we want it to be 100% wet. That's kind of the nature of a limiter. What you're trying to do with a limiter is make it so that it doesn't clip the channel. You don't want it to send too much signal through the channel, so it ends up distorting. Instead, what it ends up doing is basically saying anything that is over a certain level ends up just getting completely flattened off. Not clipped, it's just it totally reduces the volume on it to like a flat top. It's a very severe effect and it's very noticeable. And that would be like if you were to have it in, if you were to have this in, let's see, where's the brick wall mode? That's that one there. That's a limiter, where it's a flat top. Anything that goes over, what is that? 9.7 decibels negative. Anything goes over that level is just going to get squished off at the top. And I think it's much more effective to start at a lower threshold with a more forgiving ratio, so that it's not quite so extreme. And if you start with your gain staging like we talked about earlier, then you won't really run into that thing where you're clipping the channels too much. And then when you're finally at the mastering stage of the whole process, that's when you can finally crank everything up to 11 and really smash it out. So that's
what is the sound of a brick wall limiter? Because I hear it like a lot in production.
So the question for anybody that couldn't hear him there is what is the sound of a brick wall compressor? It's difficult to explain what it sounds like. It doesn't sound like something crashing into a brick wall. It just sounds dull. Like when you hear a mix that's overcompressed, it's basically like on SoundCloud, you've probably seen a track where basically the entire track from start to finish is one big black bar left to right. And it's loud, yeah, but you don't hear anything really distinctly. I mean, yeah, you hear all the different parts, but they all sound like they're exactly the same volume. Nothing hits hard, nothing hits soft. It's just blah. And that sort of applies to a lot of things. So limiters should be used very, very sparingly. Definitely never on the master channel. You might sometimes use them on individual parts of an instrument or an individual instruments themselves, because they might just have some really quirky aspects to them where a note just comes out of nowhere and peaks your channel every once in a while, and you might need a limiter just to kind of like keep that from happening. But overall, it's a very overused, because a lot of uneducated and people who just don't understand the physics behind music and sound itself don't really understand what's happening there. They think that it sounds better because it's louder. And maybe when they're just listening to that instrument by itself, yeah, it is. But once you do it to the whole mix, everything ends up being louder, and then by default, nothing is louder. So it ends up making things boring, and I guess is the short answer for that. So let's see here. The glue. Now this is a new compressor they just added to Ableton Live 9. Essentially, it's very similar setup to the other compressor. Obviously you've got a VU meter here instead of a digital readout, because it is designed to emulate an analog compressor. There were characteristics of analog compressors, like actual hardware compressors you'd have in a studio rack, that made them somewhat better for trying to get groups of instruments to come together and just kind of gel and mesh, yeah. And I am not enough of an engineer to know why that is exactly, but I can actually testify to its truth. The glue compressor, in my experience, is a much better compressor for using sparingly at the end of a mix chain. So like at the end of a channel where you're mixing a bunch of different instruments together, like one of these guys, or on your master channel when you're doing like your preliminary mix down. That's a good place to put one of these things because especially if you keep the settings nice and gentle. It's not going to affect it too much, but it will have a nice overall just strengthening effect. It's really hard to describe exactly how it ends up sounding better, but if it's bringing up the quiet stuff a certain amount and not making the louds too much quieter, but bringing them all together and just kind of making everything punch a little harder, it's just nice. And the glue is a good way to achieve that. What I think is really cool is that they actually include presets for all different types of, not all different types, but different types of sounds. I think you could probably substitute a guitar, put that on your lead channels, and approximately get the same the type of effect that they'd be going for. And by including all these different kinds of presets in there, they've made it so that you can really get some very nice, well-rounded sounds out of your individual instruments and the master chain without having to go to third-party EQ and compression VSTs. So, let's see here. Presets, sidechaining, kick drum. Okay. So, let's say that it's time to compress the sub bass every time the kick drum hits. There we go. So that's obviously that's the start of something. Now that bass, you're probably not hearing it all that great on that speaker over there, but what's happening there is that sub is hitting in the same frequency range as the kick, and it's going to muddy up the mix. It's going to make neither the bass nor the kick sound great. So what we end up doing is going into the channel here, and the sub bass has this little. You can go into here where this is the one that's designed just to work. This is the compressor that's actually in the sub bass's chain. It's not part of either voice A or voice B. It's just part of the sub bass because you don't need to duck the other ones out of the way. They're not in the same frequency range, and there's no need to unless you are doing it for effect, in which case you could put this same compressor on the whole chain instead of just in the sub bass. But for our demonstration purposes, I think it's good to just put it here. You go and you expand your compressor. You go to click on the sidechain, make sure it's active. You select your audio from. This is what's cool about Live's drum racks feature. If you end up importing a drum loop all by itself as a sample, you'll end up getting the kicks, the hats, the snares, the cymbals, everything are all going to be in the same loop, and then you're going to have to try to filter the sound to get only the kick drum to come through to hit your compressor. With this, you have to tell it which sample to go listen to. So I'm telling it to go listen to the drum rack, and I'm going to go, okay, so what part of the drum rack? Well, I wanted to listen to the kicks. Which part of the kicks? Just the kick one, pre-effects. That means it's going to listen to the kick before the kick gets compressed, before it gets any other sort of stuff added to it, which is good because you only want it to be compressing based on the original signal. So if I play that, now you'll actually see this, this compressor reacting to that kick drum. See that? Every time that kick drum hits, that compressor is hitting nice and hard too. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to that bass line and I'm going to make it so that you're only hearing that sub bass. I don't know if I can actually turn that up a little bit just so you can hear how it actually is bobbing. Hear how it's kind of in between those kicks? That is what we were trying to achieve. So success. So that's that's how sidechain compression works in a nutshell. There's a lot more to it than that in the subtleties, but that's and we could actually get it so that by doing the sub crossover, it's affecting more of the bass line by basically having the sub be more of the substance of the bass. But you could even do more stuff if you decide you wanted to like compress the whole chain, but you wanted to do it on a wet-dry basis. You could just drop that compressor over here somewhere, and then set it to a dry-wet of 50%, but like a crazy level of you know, like turn the ratio like way up to like limiter status and the threshold way down, so that half of it's being compressed like a mother and the other half of it's, you know, not. So that kind of thing is where you get some of the more like extreme sounding stuff that you'll hear where it's like it sounds super compressed, but it doesn't sound boring. So EQ and filters. So we looked at some EQ stuff before. These are where you're, you know, this is the control of the individual frequencies of the, you know, whether it's the, you know, this is lead A, lead B, lead C. These are the different frequency ranges. So if you're playing a note through lead 1, and you know, this is the voice of lead A, it only comes through in this frequency range. So that's actually more like bass ranges. In fact, that's like pretty much just bass ranges. So you might put, you know, something in there so that when your lead, like if you have a lead that has a really cool like waterfall sort of arpeggio where it's playing like a really long series of notes where they flow beautifully down like a, you know, rolling hillside. Now it sounds like fucking... Never mind. But if you wanted to get down to where the notes just keep getting lower and lower and lower, you might actually have something down in these lower bass ranges where those notes keep going no, 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 and then they become a bass, and that's okay. But in a lot of cases, what you're doing here is you're just getting like the highest little bits of that one, and the meat of this one, and the lowest bits of this one, and then what you're doing is crossing back and forth between them like this to get like a little more or a little less of each one, right? So this here is, you can actually change the, this is like a crossfade between these guys, and then this is the crossovers. This determines the frequency of each of those pieces. So the A, that's mostly in bass range, but what if we wanted to give it a little more room to play a part, and give it some more room? Now, anything that's in these frequencies is going to be played by A. But it's not going to be played by B, because B just got smaller when we turn A up. Does that make sense? Same thing with C. C and B have the same. Now you can basically make B like irrelevant by making these cross over each other, and B is going to be like, wah. So modulating these while music is playing sounds really freaking cool. So yeah, get into that. Like I said, I'll give you guys this template, and that's one of the most fun things to try. If you get each of these voices that has a really good sounding synth by itself, you know, it doesn't even have to be anything that you've, you know, spent hours slaving over. Just a good sounding preset. Drop that in there, drop a preset in there and there, and as long as they're properly suited to the frequency range that they are supposed to be playing as their default role, and you do a good job of you know, getting these knobs playing in the right ranges, minor adjustments to this stuff, maybe making them sort of go, like if you were to have one knob where you macro the two of these to one knob and you had them kind of going together like this, you could get some really awesome sounding, especially if you like synchronize it with the kind of the ebb and flow of the beat in the track. Really cool stuff you could do with that. And that's not even filtering, that's just EQ. And so I'll leave it at that. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with that. I guess one of the things I forgot to mention earlier is that this is by having these guys, this is the panning information for each of these pieces. That's centered. That's a little bit to the right, and that's a little bit to the left. That means, you know, and of course you want to have your bass notes toward the center, because basses don't play too well in the stereo field. The higher the notes get, the better they fit when you try to put them out there in the stereo field. So that's generally speaking why you want to do it that way. But here, by putting them in the different parts of the stereo field, there you actually allow the whole sound to be wider. You know, if you try to cram them all down the center channel, then everything comes through right down the middle, and it's kind of, it gets crowded there. There's only a certain amount of space to be occupied by different sounds in the whole frequency spectrum and in the stereo field. And by spacing them out a little bit like that, you give the whole sound a little bit more room to breathe, and you know, it can stand a little more broad-shouldered and actually, you know, intimidate you. I need to just stop with these extended metaphors. Sometimes they end up going nowhere. All right, so that's EQ. EQ, there's different types of EQ. What we're using here is an EQ8. Although I'm actually only using 2 of the nodes on that EQ. There's more of them you can end up activating to give yourself more control of the various different parts of it, but it allows you to do all different kinds of stuff. I would say for some situations, it's a lot easier and more effective to use something simpler like EQ3, which is, where is that here? This is like more like a DJ mixer EQ. There's a low, a mid, and a high gain, and then you can change the frequency at which the crossover between those two happens, and the frequency at which the crossover between those two happens. So you can, you know, some of the same stuff can be accomplished, but one of the downsides is it doesn't have any visual representation of any of that. So it's kind of a, you know, you have to know exactly what you're trying to achieve with this. Like I said, this is really cool in a DJ mixer kind of role, and it's great if you're using this for live sets because you can put this on like each of your channels, and you map these to different knobs, and basically be doing the same thing that someone would do with a DJ mixer. You gotta take off?
Be in touch. I just didn't want to interrupt you.
Oh, hey, it's cool. Thanks for coming. Really appreciate it.
Awesome, man. Be in touch for sure.
Sounds good. Cool. So EQ3, get rid of that. All right, you've already seen what EQ8 can do. One of the things I think is important about Live 9 is that it actually does offer the ability for you to take the spectrum analysis and actually have it playing, showing you what the waveform is actually doing in the background here. It used to be that you had to have a spectrum analysis plugin next to it so you could see what you were bringing in and what you were subtracting. Now, if you have a really annoying resonant frequency, you can just go into your EQ, you turn on that's this mode right here where it actually is going to be playing that waveform in the background. You go, all right, I'm looking for that resonant peak on this wave here. Where does it look like the highest little annoying like sharp note is? You go look at that, and then you take one of these guys, and then you set your Q up nice and high so that it's basically a sharp resonant peak, and instead of turning the gain up, you drag it down, and you basically just create a notch around that resonant frequency, and most of the time that solves it. And you can actually see the effect of where that's occurring as well. So it's really, that's I think what makes EQ8 a very strong plugin. Not to mention the fact that 8's got formant filters. So these are essentially, they're not really filters, they are EQ, but formants are what allows humans' oral cavities to make vowel sounds. When you make a vowel sound, you're actually creating a very complex filter between your tongue, your what do you call it, like nasal cavities, and like the palate of your mouth, and all that stuff is contributing to a very unique shape. And you combine the different pieces of those together, and you get these very complex sounds that end up being vowels. So you look at what an A looks like. That's what it takes to make an A.
So you can put that on like your bass line, you get like vowel bass.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. This is what it takes to make an ooh sound, yeah. Right? Yeah, like these things are ridiculous. Like, somebody spent a lot of time figuring out exactly what it is to make these different sounds. And what's cool is you can, you can modulate the different parts of these things around too. So you can take this guy and move him around like that. Take that frequency knob, macro it out. So like if you had this whole thing on an effects rack, you could macro that knob out, and you can. That's how Skrillex gets growl basses. P.S.
Yeah.
So that and a bunch of frequency modulated synthesis, like we were talking about with Operator. Another popular one is FM8, but we don't have time to get into that. All right. Auto filter, frequency, resonant. Okay, so yeah, what we were looking at there was EQs. There's actually a filter plugin that does some of the same stuff, but it has, because it's simpler and pretty much just only involves one node, you can say, all right, I want to, drop this on. This is another one of those things that's better as a DJ effect than as a producer effect, although it can be useful for bringing instruments in slowly or fading them out slowly. If you've got like a bass line you want it to come in and you want the more complex parts of it to become more apparent as time goes on, you could modulate the frequency like this and then bring it in gradually like this as the track progresses. You can also add a little bit of the Q, which is the resonance, where it's just adding a little bit of a kind of a peak right there where the filter point is, and that's what gives it a little bit of just like raw, gritty nature. when you hear a filter that sounds like wind blowing over a whistle, that's what that is. It's like basically having a peak turned up way high like that. So, all right. Oh, effects, resonance. Oh yeah, there is the reason they call it auto filter is that there's some cool stuff you can do with automation in it. You can actually use an LFO to modulate the parameters of the auto filter. So if you put that together with an auto pan and a couple other things that have some like automatic modulation in them, you can get some really interesting, just like groovy soundscapes to add on top of your existing instruments. And because you can synchronize them with the beat, you know, you can end up making them really add a little bit of that sort of add some motion to the track, or like forward motion, I should say. All right, phaser flanger. I don't want to get into actually opening up the plugin and showing how it all works and everything. Basically, the concept of a phaser is that it's taking similar kind of to the chorus in some ways, where it's taking two versions of the track and playing them, except with the chorus, it's playing them at the same time, just at a slightly different pitch. Versus the phaser is actually delaying them or speeding them up a little bit. So when you get a phaser and you've got like the more they call poles of a phaser, is basically you're adding more copies of that sound wave that's being played on top of itself. Phasing, you get one that's going slightly ahead and slightly behind. You get this kind of, best way to describe it, like when people hear it, it sounds like a jet engine flying by you. It's like this kind of sound. The flanger was invented after the phaser. The phaser is basically doing that, not with precision. It's just you're adding that effect and going, hey, doesn't that sound cool? The flanger actually listens to the incoming signal in terms of the note value, and then does mathematical computations on it and says what are the optimum places to put the different poles here to make it so that they add a good like texture to this. And then there's ways that you can change the computation algorithm so that it does different things based on that. But whereas this is actually using the frequency of the incoming note as a deciding factor on how that sound ends up coming out, versus the phaser actually ends up changing the quality of the phase based on what note you're playing. Because the higher frequency you play, the less out of phase something has to be to sound more, to make more of an effect. When something's barely out of phase at a low frequency, you don't notice it. But if it's barely out of phase at a high frequency, it's like, whoa! That's what makes the big difference between those two. Distortion. 3 different types of distortion. There's overdrive, amp, and saturator. They all are doing different things. Let's see here. I guess the amp. It doesn't have a lot of adjustments, but it offers some really cool, like, if you just want to add some distortion to you don't want to really mess around with it, this is fantastic. Throw that on there, put the heavy on, turn the drive wet, somewhere in the middle, and rock out. That's it. Very, very little adjustment needed with that, and it's a great distortion, especially if you're doing anything with guitars. Fantastic. Overdrive is the same concept that's being applied with that amp plugin. This is much more basic. It's actually just adding overdrive, and it's not adding any of the sort of warmth of that. Other one was actually using software to emulate the tube amplifier type of sound, whereas this one is just strict overdrive, and it's very, very simple. It does have a little bit of a filter built in that you can only overdrive certain portions of the signal, and has dry wet, and you can do that too. There's also the saturator, which is this guy here. This is a wave shaper. What you're doing here is you're taking the incoming signal and distorting it slightly to give it a shape that is closer to whatever the shape that you select here is. It's not exactly like it, and it won't ever be exactly like it, but the amount that you're adding the drive is basically if you're trying to get that wave to shift around in its shape, that is distorting it based on the wave shaper. And the more I should say the more of these, the more gentle ones, obviously, like these ones don't sound as harsh. If you get up to these guys, like Digital Clip, that starts sounding kind of harsh because it's got these sharp edges on it. So cool thing to check out. That's actually what's being used in the return channel over here for the exciter. It's a preset called a bit warmer, where it is it's really excellent for adding that sizzle to those highs like we were talking about earlier.
All right.
Delay, simple delay, and ping pong. I'll actually just talk about the two of them at the same time. Simple delay, what it's doing is just adding some delay to the signal. You can choose whether you want it to be synchronized to the beat, or whether you want it to be just kind of a delay that seems to sort of randomly echo, and not randomly like changing each time, but you can base it on milliseconds, which usually it doesn't get you where you need to be, where you want the echoes to actually end up being rhythmic. So where the simple delay is actually very useful is in doing some, let's see, I think I added it to, what did I add it to? I added it to, there's nothing on the percussion channel, so you won't be able to hear what it sounds like, but you can make a cool stereo widener effect with it. There's an interesting way that the human brain processes sound. When you hear a sound come in to one ear, and then it enters the other ear because of the difference in the speed of sound, your brain actually detects the difference in time that it took for that sound to get from one ear to the other, and it uses that to determine where the sound came from. So you add a little bit of extra to that effect by adding, like, we're going in here into stereo widener, and I'll show you what the chain looks like. Come on. All right. This is the dry chain, which means there's nothing actually being applied to it. But this is a left channel where it's being panned hard left. Time fluctuates between 1 milliseconds and I think I have it go all the way up to 25 milliseconds. And then the other one I have set with the same macro knob, but it goes between 35, and I think this one goes all the way down to 5. Yeah. So basically what's happening here is you're starting with almost no difference in the time that it takes for the sound to get between your left ear and your right ear. And as you turn this knob up, the time that it takes for that sound to get from your right ear to to get to each one individually increases. And then depending on, you can also have the dry wet, where you've got a dry signal that's coming through that's hitting right when it's supposed to, and then the wet signal is hitting slightly delayed on one side and even more delayed on the other side. And because of such a short time span, I mean, they're talking about in the low double digits milliseconds. It doesn't even sound like an echo. It just sounds like you're in a tight box with this loud sound, and it's like right in your face. And that's what it ends up sounding like, is it's just coming at you from all angles. But the more you add the width to it, the more it ends up sounding like that tight box is more like a shipping crate, or So that's what you could end up using this for. And I would say, man, to actually take this thing and put it on other stuff, because I mean, I just made this last night. I was like, dude, I need to be using this. So, but that's a good use for simple delay. Ping pong delay is a lot more where you would actually use that for rhythmic elements, because the ping pong actually ends up bouncing off the left and right sides of the stereo field, kind of in time with the music. So you have the main sound, say, comes down the center. It goes bong, 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 like that, and it's kind of nice because especially with some more of the like music that's sort of a little more percussive in nature, things like a Montauban and things like that. I think people like that use a lot of sort of the ping pong effects and stuff like that, because it's being rhythmic in nature allows it to contribute a lot to the rhythm of the music, while still keeping the track minimal in feel. Because if you're not adding any new sounds, you're just adding more different versions of the same one. So it's cool. I might recommend trying it, especially on your percussion. It's cool. All right, resonators. I won't open this one up and actually show it to you, but resonator, what it's doing is takes the incoming signal, makes a copy of it, allows you to shift it up a certain amount. It's basically like, it's kind of like chorus, but you can actually choose the exact amount that you're shifting each version of the sound that's coming through. You can choose how many different ones that you want to add on top of it, and how much you want to shift them around in the frequency range. It's pretty cool. It takes some time to get it to make it sound good, and it's more useful in a longer chain of effects where you're adding other ones along with it and modulating some of the parameters together. It's kind of like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of there's like certain foods where they're not really good by themselves, but they work great on other stuff. Like salt. You don't need salt by itself, but well, some people do. All right, so reverb. Live comes with a basic reverb. It's let's see, where is it? Reverb. It's actually the same one that's being used on. There's two different versions of reverb on the returns here. You've got a short reverb, which is a small room. Long reverb, which would be like a concert hall. Maybe more like a studio and a concert hall or a stadium. Short delay and long delay, you know, echoes basically. And then these are what people think of when they think of an echo in their head. When they go, hello, hello, hello. That's actually delay. Reverb is more of what you would actually hear if you were to do that in like a cavern, where you don't actually hear the very same word come back to you. It's just more like a hello, hello, hello. It's just this kind of slow decaying, where the echo is coming back to you from so many different points at different times, where there's not really a definitive, the sound hits you exactly the same way as it did when it left. That's more like what reverb is, and it ends up sounding more like a chamber type of effect. You know, you're hearing it, reverb every time you go to the Aggie, whether you know it or not. It's there. They have some soundproofing, but it's you know, it's older than our grandparents. All right. So that's a basic reverb. It's a digital reverb. It's completely 100% done by software. Doesn't have any analog components to it. So in a sense, it's going to be pretty efficient overall. I mean, reverb is kind of intensive as far as processor is concerned, but this would be one of the more efficient reverbs that you could use. There's different quality levels you can use. If you put an eco, that uses the lowest level of CPU, but it also has the, you know, kind of the sound doesn't sound as convincing. The convincing reverb is convolution reverb, which is this new one that they've just introduced in Live 9, which Live Suite pretty much only has this, but it allows you to take a sound, say like I recorded that clap sound. You hear that kind of like sort of vibrating sound that happens after. That's the sound of that sound bouncing back and forth off of these walls over and over again. You're basically hearing the oscillation of that sound hitting each direction. You can actually record that specific reverb, plug it into convolution reverb, and then tell convolution reverb to emulate that on everything else. So yeah, there's a guy who I follow, Afro DJ Mac, who has produced. He actually doesn't produce a lot of music, but he has made hundreds of Ableton Live racks out of different instruments. Basically, he finds different stuff lying around. He's like, "Ooh, this would be cool to sample." Plugs up a high-grade microphone, hits it in every way possible that you could imagine, maps it all out to different ways that you can play it, and then releases it. All of them are for free. One of them he did recently. He went to a place in Northern California where there's like the redwood forest, and he just went in the middle of the forest, and then recorded the reverb of that clap echoing off of the trunks of all these trees in the forest, and I swear to you, man, that reverb sounds like a freaking forest. And it's so cool. Like it is, and that's why this is such a cool plugin. And one of the things that makes Max for Live so dynamite is because you can do stuff like that with it. So, anyway. Effects racks, channel strips. We've actually covered almost all of this. Covered key velocity zones, macro knobs, all of that. The only thing we haven't talked about is the utility, which is so small it'll take no time at all. That's this guy. It allows you to adjust the gain. It allows you to adjust whether it's going to be just right, just left, or stereo. You can choose the panorama position, the left or right position, and the width, which basically, like, I don't really know exactly how to describe this, but it does sound wider the more you turn it up. It also gets quieter though, so you have to be careful if you're going to turn your width up. You have to make sure that you're turning up your gain a little bit to compensate for it. This is the thing. If you're going to make automation in terms of your gain levels and in terms of your stereo field stuff, and you're not going to use like an auto pan for the stereo field stuff, use this, because when you're in here, you can add automation to the clip itself with a clip envelope. So I could go in here and say I'm in bass, and I want to go into the bass channel bass channel strip. Let's see here, to the utility, device on gain panorama. Boom. If I want to do left and right pans on that bass sound, this is where I can automate it, and I can put the automation directly into this clip. And then once it's in this clip, I can play it live. I can move that clip around different places, and that automation sticks with it. Versus if you were to put it over here, the automation doesn't necessarily stick with it. So, and it's a lot harder to keep track of it. That's why I do almost all of my initial sound design and concept stuff in the session view, because I can put all that stuff into the clips themselves, and then once I've got a really, like, man, this sounds like it'll be a great song once it's 4 minutes long, you know, start clicking and dragging pieces of it and basically taking these, you know, now I've got a set of Legos, I got to turn it into a castle, you know. That's the mentality that I use behind putting this stuff together. So yeah, use the clip envelopes modulation for that kind of stuff. Utility is fantastic. It does very few things and does all of them well. MIDI effects, individual note characteristics. You've got the ability to adjust the velocity, the pitch, the length, and scale of any of the individual notes that are coming through a channel. We talked a little bit about this earlier when I took that thing, that pitch adjustment, and I put it on the sub bass, and I dropped it down by an octave. You can just over here in the MIDI effects, you know, you got your pitch. You can change. These are octaves. Like I said, octave is 12 semitones. Note length. This will actually adjust the length of the notes that are coming through. So if you held the note down for a long time, but you're like, you know, I want all of the notes to be exactly the same length, you can make them so that they're all exactly the same length with this. So basically, these are the MIDI notes that are feeding down into this, which is then feeding audio into the master channel when it comes out your speakers. So these are the instructions, like in a player piano, then this is the actual instrument, and then these are your ears. And if you want to be able to change the instructions before they get to the instrument, you got to put them over here or in between the stuff in here before it gets to the actual thing that makes the sound, basically. Once it's there, then it's too late. Let's see. Talked about there's ways to adjust the velocity of the notes. You can make it so that they're all you can automate the velocity with that stuff. As I mentioned, you can change the scale. These are like, okay, so you know, this is more music theory stuff, but if you want, you can just say, man, I want to make a track in the Phrygian Ahava Rabba scale. You could drop that on every one of your MIDI tracks, and then just fill all of your MIDI clips with just a bunch of random blah. And this scale would actually force every note that you were playing into the closest note that fit to that scale. That's one of the greatest ways. If you're just, man, I'm a writer's block right now, I can't come up with any melodies. Throw one of those guys onto a channel and then just like hit record, and then just take your keyboard and go like, da, 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 and then like just make all kinds. It doesn't even matter at all, and it will make melodic parts out of it. It'll probably still sound kind of crappy, but it'll make something that's, oh, I like that little part right there. Maybe repeat that a few times. Lengthen that one, change that note to this. Oh yeah, that sounds great. You know, that kind of stuff gives you way more ability to sort of let the randomness of nature inspire you, and then not just having to wait for nature to do it by itself. You can be like, inspire me, and yeah.
Does that work live too?
Yeah.
So that's the ease mode for being a keyboard master.
Yeah. Now, of course, people are going to know you're doing it if they see you. A lot of people play piano, and a lot of people will be able to tell you're faking it. But I mean, it is one way to do that. And you know, I thought about putting that on. I've got a little thing that I use for my guitar that actually takes the guitar signal as analog, and then takes both the guitar's sound as analog and puts that into the computer, and then also turns the guitar's notes as MIDI data, and then sends that into the computer as separate parts. And I've been wanting to put a synth in parallel with the guitar, but the MIDI synchronization part of it isn't quite, it's not perfect. There are times when you're going to hit a note and it's going to think you're playing the wrong note.
Gotcha.
And so you play a note and it sounds good on the guitar, but the synth is like, I thought, yeah, that'd be kind of cool if I knew what scale I was going to be playing in. I could throw that on there, and then it would play the right MIDI notes, and especially like if I was hitting the right ones, then when I did the pitch bends, it would still hit those too. It's difficult to say exactly whether that would work well. I haven't actually executed it yet, but there are, that's one of the thousands of ways that you can get really creative with this software and totally lose yourself. Okay, so that's all that stuff. Note modulation, you can actually make some of your notes become randomized. That's really cool for those like chiptune sounds where you want to make something sound like a Star Trek computer going blah, 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 you may not find that very musical, but it can be kind of a cool effect to bring in like as a pad or something like that that sort of just adds some spaciness to your music. MIDI effects racks, this is where you're basically taking the same concept that we were just applying with effects racks and with instrument racks, applying that to MIDI effects, being able to apply more than one different MIDI effect to a series of MIDI notes before allowing them to go through, or maybe processing them in parallel and then letting more than one set of those notes go through. That's what you'd use a MIDI effect rack for. You can also make chords out of a single note, so you can have one note go in and have 3 notes come out, and they could be in a certain chord. So arpeggiator is basically, it's an automatic, it's a little program. It's basically you give it one note and then it's going to go, it'll create a scale that plays in a sequence from that one note, and you give it it's similar to that scale thing that you were just saying earlier. You give it a scale you want it to play in, and you give it a single note to play from, and it will give you a series of notes that come out of that. And that's a really great way to, again, one of those things where you can just kind of give it something simple that doesn't even require a lot of creative input, and it'll come up with something that sounds pretty good. And then you can take it from there. Audio clips. All right, so we've done quite a bit now. We're so close to the end, guys. I apologize for how long this has taken. Samples. I'm just going to drop a sample in here. It doesn't matter what it is. Come on, drop in there. All right. Within here, there's all these different parts here. There's the clip control here, where you can choose if you've got your groove pool turned on, which is the swing, like the forward and backward motion of your. You can either make a beat sound very steady, or it can make it sound the swing, the groove, the shuffle. There's different ways of calling it. Anyway, you can have that turned on. If there's groove that's being applied to your track, you can choose which groove to apply here. Launch mode. You can either have it trigger every time that you hit the note to play it here. It's going to play it. Oh God, that sounds terrible. Ugh. Wow. Okay, but every time that you hit it, it plays. When it's done playing, it stops, unless you have that loop thing turned on. If it's playing loop, then it's just going to go back and play it over and over again. That is the default mode for any clip that you put into live. It's going to play it until it gets to the end, and it's going to start back over at the beginning. That's kind of how it was designed to be a live performance program, kind of from the ground up. You can also put it in other different modes, though. There's a gate mode where it only plays when you're hitting the key. As soon as you let go, it stops. There's toggle, which is where it plays until you hit the note again, and then it stops playing. And then repeat. There it is. Holding mouse down repeatedly triggers the clip at its quantization interval. So yeah, not the mouse, but if you were holding down the button that corresponded to that note, whatever your quantization interval is in here, it will actually, you can hold it down and it'll stutter, and then it'll play the rest of it out as soon as you let go. If you're going to be using audio clips to generate percussion sounds, you're going to want to make sure you turn this fade thing off, because percussion sounds rely on the very, very, very beginning sound right in here, that transient information where it's going to hit, pow. That very first little bit is the characteristic, the defining moment of any drum sound. And what a fade does is it's basically fading in that sound over the course of, what is it? It's 0.4 milliseconds. You know, just enough time for it to make every drum sound kind of so I would recommend not having that turned on if you're going to use it for percussion. But most people are going to only use these samples for things that are going to be a little bit longer than that. And the reason that's there is because it helps prevent there being from a click or a pop whenever the sound comes in. So that's a good thing to have. If you've got few audio clips in your overall set, but you want them to always be able to play very quickly without any sort of delay in loading them or any potential to glitch, but by giving extra load to the CPU, just make it so that it loads the whole clip into RAM, and then it doesn't have to pull it from the hard disk from time to time when as it's playing. So again, as I mentioned before, these are your different warp modes. You can choose, you know, what type of warping you want. Now it allows you to choose from Complex Pro, which is just a slightly more advanced version of the complex algorithm. Usually the best thing to do there is to play the sample with each one, see how it sounds. You'll find the best one and go, all right, that's the one to use for that. Your looping length stuff. These are your start and end points. You can adjust a lot of that stuff with these actual sliders up here too. And then these are the envelope automation stuff that you can adjust as well. So you can do volume modulation. This is more track panning modulation, things like that. So you can do all that stuff in audio clips as well as in MIDI clips. And you just like I said, you put those nodes on that little pink line and you move them around to get the motion going. All right, warping modes, pitch independent, tempo. Okay, so what's happening with the warping? If you lengthen it and you have it in one of the warp modes that's not the repitch mode, it's going to basically play the same note just longer. Eventually, that ends up sounding kind of weird because it ends up having to do some manipulation of the sound that eventually becomes more obvious the more you try to keep stretching it out. But generally, smaller amounts, not too drastic, are almost unnoticeable. If you choose the right algorithm. The same thing goes for basically you can pitch shift something without changing its tempo. So that's when you hear people take like a vocal sample and they just pitch it way down and they go bro, 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 bro. It's basically someone just took this thing and instead of warping it, lengthening it, they went and they put it in warp mode and they just changed the transposition. They just dragged that down about an octave or two, and now all of a sudden it sounds like a demon instead of a guy. So that's how all that stuff works. And again, if you're conservative enough with it, whether you're not overusing it, it's not going to be noticeable unless you're actually going for it, trying to be noticeable. There's also the ability to fix times where you've got a track where the original tempo moves around a little bit. For instance, Nirvana, they didn't use a drum machine to make their beats. They had what's his face, Dave Grohl on the drums, and he would get really excited when that chorus came along, so he'd kick it up a couple BPM, and so I made a mashup a while ago of featuring a lot of the instruments from Smells Like Teen Spirit, and that had some very drastic tempo shifts in it, and I ended up having to go through and manually find each individual transient point all the way through the track and move them to make sure that they would all hit exactly where they were supposed to on the grid, which took a long time, but it was totally worth it. So if you're, that's another use of warping besides just moving tracks between different tempos. You can actually kind of fix them. I'm sure Dave Grohl would probably have a problem with me calling it fixed, but he has a problem with computer music in general. Okay, the ALS file is a separate file that gets saved next to whatever audio sample file you happen to drag into Live. If you drag it in there, Live analyzes it and it drops a little file that has the same name, .als, right next to it in your file system. Don't delete that file, or any warp markers you've added to it will be lost. So just keep in mind that that file is not junk. It actually serves a purpose. I wish that they could just write that information into the file itself, but yeah. All right, looping. As I mentioned, you can adjust your loop position and all that kind of stuff here. Where was I? Okay, convert audio to MIDI. Something that's actually kind of melodic, right? I'm going to take this and drop it in here. Now this has got some definitely different notes, and say I want to make that, I want to take that melody, but I want to make it out of a completely different instrument. This is great for remixing, by the way. Someone gives you their original synth line, and you can go, great, I love that melody. I'm going to do something completely different with it. Right-click on it and go to Convert Melody to New MIDI Track. You can convert harmony if you've got a track that has, or a sample that has more than one note playing at once. It's a little bit less accurate, but it does get more than one note to be recognized. So this one's actually just, it's pretty straightforward. So what this is going to do is simultaneously it is computing the MIDI notes, not just the notes themselves, but the velocity information, like how loud the note hits, how long it's being played. Not only that, but it also is giving, generally, it's trying to emulate somewhat the sound of that synth. It listened to that synth and said, how can we make something that sounds kind of like that? Well, I bet if I play this now, it'll sound a lot like that. So it's a little bit and is going to need to be adjusted, obviously. It's not quite perfect, but it's closer than I would have been if I'd sit there trying to like key every single note myself from start to finish. So it's a very, very useful tool. And you can do that with almost any set of notes. If you had a melody in your head and you're like, oh man, this is a catchy tune. I don't want to forget this. Good thing I brought my Lucky Pocket recorder. You hum the notes in there, and then when you get home, you go, okay, great. Record it, let it analyze it, and now you have a synth line. Again, it's probably going to need some adjusting. It's not going to be completely straightforward and perfect every time, but it'll be a great start, and it helps you skip some of the monotonous parts at the beginning of writing a track that sometimes get in the way of you even sitting down in the first place. So, the very same thing as I mentioned before, you can do it with harmony. Drums, if you were to put a drum loop in there, it's more specialized to try to listen for individual types of drum. So, okay, you know, toms, snares, hats, all that kind of stuff. It looks for those individual sounds and then maps them to a drum rack that has approximately those same sounds in it. So, that was really cool. If you got like a really like diverse loop library, but you're like, I don't want to just use somebody's drum loop in my track. That's lame. That's not original enough. But I love that progression of percussive notes. I like that, but I want to make different sounds. You can just take that loop, analyze it, put it in a completely different drum rack, make your own drum rack out of it. Done deal. So that was an audio clip. Over here in the MIDI clip, there's the same type of boxes. Octave shifting. Okay, this is kind of cool. So if you're in the MIDI notes themselves here, and say you've got a series of notes, you're like, you know, those are too low. I need to shift them up an octave. Select them all, shift, and the arrow up, shifts them up 1 octave. Or down, shifts them down 1 octave. You can also, if you have them all selected, you hold down the Option key, you click on one, you can click and drag and create another copy of it, and you just go up to there, there's another octave. Boom. Now we actually play a completely different, now I think that bass instrument was actually monophonic, so you probably wouldn't hear them both at the same time. But that's the general idea, is you can manipulate your MIDI notes that way. You can also, this is your velocity information down here, so this is the like how hard each one of those notes hits. They're all playing exactly the same because I manually drew them in. But you could make the notes hit slightly softer or slightly louder, or say you've got, like, for instance, in a drum rack, so you want to add that thing where the where they have the snare roll at the end of a loop before it transitions to the next snare, or to the next loop. You could add a bunch of these guys in there, but you don't want them to all sound the same. You want them to kind of go, you want them to get louder and harder, right? And you select them all. I'm trying to remember, I think you hold down the Command key, and yep, hold down the Command key, draw a line through there, and it basically makes the ones over here lower in velocity all the way to a higher over here. but it's only the ones you actually have selected when you do that. It's not the other ones in there. That's why this is kind of confusing, because this one is actually that one, and this one is this. Yeah, it's. I would not try to actually manipulate the individual nodes themselves. Just try to select the ones that you want to actually make changes to. Another thing you can do is if you want to make them all go up a little bit or all down a little bit, you can hold down the command key, and then it turns the cursor into this little guy, and you can drag the whole thing down. And you see how the ones that are the loudest are actually coming down more than the other ones. It actually adjusts everything kind of. It's like geometrically according to their position when you started doing it. So it's very smart the way they've done it. We did automation stuff. This would be like baseline. In the envelopes, you've got your. This would be like your the pitch bend. If you wanted to like add some fun, gnarly. Like this will make that pitch. Well, assuming there's actually some good pitch bend stuff. This is the other thing, is you have to check your pitch bend control in the actual synth voices themselves, because sometimes their pitch bend instructions will be like, oh, you're only supposed to change certain number of semitones. And let's see, where is the semitone control? This one, pitch bend 5 semitones. Well, that's typically not going to sound all that great, especially if you're using one of those keyboards that has the pitch bend control on the side where it lets you go up or down and actually has a stopper on either end. I find the best way to rig that one up is to actually have it to be a full octave pitch, so you go, and that ends up hitting exactly a note higher than what, or an octave higher than what you're playing at that moment. So I usually just change any of these to 12 and call it good. So you could, that would sound better. Now that I hear it, I'm like, oh, now I know why. All right, that would have sounded better if I went like this, or maybe even. So same sort of modulation you can do with almost anything. This is just the pitch mod, but we could do it with. You could do like, if you were to tie this in with one or two of those macro knobs, and then tie those in with 15 other different variables further down the chain, you end up getting so much complexity that you can, again, that's how Skrillex achieves what he does. And whether or not you like his music, you can't possibly argue that it is not some of the most complex and impressive, from a technological standpoint, music being made. MIDI input. This is the device control. So these 8 will be mapped to these 8. Automatically. And then if I'm like, okay, cool, I'm done modulating those, I'm going to go to the next device in the chain. So that jumps to where I'm actually controlling the features of the operator itself, rather than this guy. And you can just keep going right on down the chain, controlling different parts of different stuff. So this is a very, very popular device for DJing. There's actually a feature that we're not seeing here because I have it turned off. The crossfader, right there. You can have each one of the channels in here assigned to a side. You'd have deck A and deck B all the way on down the chain. So right now it's only playing the orange ones, and the other now it's only playing the yellow ones, and so now it's playing everything. So very, very versatile instrument this is. And this adjusts the Q level, scene launch stuff. So this is where it actually plays the whole scene at once. That one would, of course, play 2, which stops everything else. Or you could play, this stops all clips, and then I could actually just launch one clip by itself, just like the kick. Then bring in the, and then you can also do, right? So I mean, this is very, very basic stuff that I'm doing here. It's not even remotely impressive, but it's important to know that not only are there things like this out there, they're actually specifically designed for Ableton, and it comes out of the box pretty much set up to do almost everything you're going to need it to do. You might want to tweak it with some of your own parameters at some point, but it is set up with this software particularly in mind. Default mappings, map MIDI mode. Yeah. So I think I showed you guys this before, which was in here where I went into the map mode, and then we could change the strength of whatever mapping is being applied, like whatever its minimum value is going to be, whatever its maximum value is going to be. If you have multiple parameters mapped, you can make them different so that they end up not just all sounding like they're doing exactly the same thing. So that's MIDI map mode. You can, any parameter that you see anywhere on here, you can map to something. So, right. And then now get out of the MIDI map mode again. There we go. So, and that's really easy stuff to set up. It's so point and click. You don't have to know anything about programming or any of that kind of stuff to get any of this stuff working. There's all kinds of goodies that you can get into in the back end if you want to get really nerdy with it. It just, you know, kind of depends on your personality type, I guess. I've got some leanings that direction myself, but I know not everyone is that way. So, let's see. That was MIDI map. There's also key map mode, which is where you can map the individual keys on your keyboard. So if you want to use your computer's keyboard like an instrument, you can actually say, all right, whenever I press such and such key, I want it to do that thing. So, you know, say like I want, every time I press the 1 button for it to play that bass line, you know. So now it doesn't stop. I have to map a different button for the stop button, but you know, you can adjust the quantization. Or get even more crazy with it. So I wanted to show you guys a little bit of stuff about sampling, like being able to like take it, you know, this guy, you know, record something on it, plug it in here, drop the audio file into Ableton Live, and then do some found object sampling, where you're basically just taking sounds you found around places and drop them into a drum rack and sit there and make some cool stuff with it. But that'll probably end up becoming more something we do with a sound design course. But that's pretty much it, guys. That took way longer than I thought it was going to. Like, holy shit, way longer. But I really appreciate you guys sticking with me here. This has been a lot of fun, and I think, oh my gosh, look at that, it's still going. Oh my god, there's people still attached. Ah, yes, yes. All right. Can I I'm gonna go ahead and say we're now open for questions. I'm gonna go ahead and ask your questions. If you have individual questions, try to separate them out into separate questions, and separate, send the first one, then send another one, then send another one, and then I'll answer each one individually. I'm going to take questions from these guys for now, and what I'll end up doing is just repeating what they say so that you can hear the question that they asked, and then we'll go from there. All right. Which one of you guys wants to go first? I was hoping that people would bring notepads so they can just take notes about the stuff that they were wondering about. I guess I didn't make it clear ahead of time that I was going to only take questions at the end, though, so I apologize for that. Shit.
Something you kind of mentioned of just getting discouraged on a track before you even start, just because you sit down and press buttons for 3 hours. And all right, let's see what we have. And it's yeah. All right. Right. So what specifically, what were you wondering about?
Is there a good way to prevent that, or is there a?
Oh, okay, all right. So this is kind of getting into the time management stuff. All right. So the question is when you're working on a track, when you sit down to work on it, and you put 5 hours into it, and you sit back and go, what did I just accomplish? I have nothing but a basic drum loop, and you wonder where all that time went. A lot of times it goes into tweaking, especially, and I don't mean doing meth. I mean, you're taking your well, some people probably do, but you've got so many different knobs you can fiddle with. It's just ridiculous. And the thing is, that you have to almost force yourself in certain ways to not take advantage of all the different options you have available to you. Less is more in terms of being able to jumpstart your creativity. If you have too many options, you have no options. That's kind of the general consensus that I've been coming to through my own experience and also by talking to a lot of other producers. So couple ways you can do that is by trying to limit your time spent on any one given task. So I actually have a little like timer application that I'll have running that'll give me a half an hour to work on a bass line. And I'll have to give myself rules and say, now by work on the bass line, I don't mean adjust the compressor on the bass. I mean work on notes in the bass line. And if I still have more time and I feel like, man, that's a good bass line, I'll write a variation of it. I'll go and make some more different versions of it, still keeping in that same confine of, okay, I'm only working on notes of my bass. I will work on the sound design in a different portion of this evening. And if you budget that time and keep yourself to those times, if your alarm go off, and as soon as that alarm goes off, it doesn't matter if you're in the middle of doing something or not, you cut it off, move on to the next task. And that, I think, forces you to break out of some of those loops where you start getting into just like being lost in like preset land and just tweaking knobs forever and ever. I mean, I've seriously probably lost several hundred, maybe even thousands of hours but without actually having anything to show for it because of the amount of time that I've just dropped into messing around with stuff. To a degree, yeah, it has taught me a lot about the stuff that I use, and I know a lot about a lot of different things, but knowing a lot isn't, to me, that isn't even as cool as making a lot. I want to make more music, so I think that having those habits in place make it a lot easier to finally break past those barriers, and I think my more recent productions actually do reflect that to a degree. So, is that a good answer, guys? Okay. Let me see. I'll see if the peanut gallery here has anything to say. Let's see. No questions. There's still viewers, but nobody's asked any questions yet. I'm a sad panda. You guys, come on. Questions. I just talked for like 4 hours. Get at me. Okay, it wasn't 4. Wait, was it? Yeah, it's close. It's like this. Yeah. All right. Yeah, 3.5. Jeez, dude. My last, I made one of these videos called the Ableton Live Freshman Seminar, and originally I was like, man, I'm going to make this 1 hour long. It ended up being 2 hours. I was like, man, next time I do this, I'm going to cut it down a lot shorter. You know, I'm going to know what I'm doing next time. I'm going to have an outline. Apparently, that only makes it take longer. It's possible they hadn't heard me ask for questions yet because they're delayed a little bit from us. So maybe they're just now hearing. Yeah, they're like, what? So keep at it, guys. Give me some more. So like, I don't know. What do you think? What are your thoughts about this? What kind of music do you want to make? What do you like? What do you want to do?
I'm looking to make dubstep, maybe a little bit more trancey openings and before the drops, but then just really very traditional dirty drops with the dub.
Cool.
I mean, do you have a set like I'm going to do the drums first and the bass line, then the leads and the samples? Do you ever do that? Or do you ever go all over the place with it? Because I've heard kind of conflicting stories about which. I'm sure it's just personal preference, but. Okay.
All right. So the answer or the question was basically where to start with what to work on first to really get a track going, and that's and there's been a lot of conflicting information about that. And the reason there's conflicting information is because everyone's different. Some people, it will work better to start on the drums first, and other people, that doesn't inspire them enough to continue working on the track. I know people who have hundreds of tracks that are unfinished, that they just got partway through it and they're like, meh. And I'm not saying it's because they're doing it in the wrong order. I don't necessarily know if that's the case, but what I do know is that when you do have things in the wrong order, it does tend to cause you to stall out. You know, you lose interest in something because you've been working on it for hours, but nothing sounds cool yet. And if that's the case, you're going to burn out. And it's like you almost have to make that one of your first priorities, is make sure that the process is still entertaining for you. Because if you get bored doing it, you're going to hate your hobby, and that, you know, you won't be doing it for very long. So, yeah, it's a good question, though. I would say experiment with it. Like the first few times you make a track, try making it a different way at first. Try starting with something different. I think a good way to judge what type of person you probably are is what interests you more. Are you more like a rhythmic kind of person? Do you really get into the groove kind of stuff, or do you just love soaring melodies and you just love harmonies and interplay of that kind of stuff? And that will help you determine whether you're more the kind of person who want to write the melody first, or the bass line first, or the drums. Drums are a good thing to have in there because if you don't have rhythm to at least kind of set the pace for the track, you don't really even have you need a marching rhythm, I think. Before you even start, you need a marching rhythm, and then after that, you can kind of go with that. I would say come up with a really basic drum kit first. It doesn't have to be a finished drum kit. It doesn't have to have any of your compression stuff set up or anything like that. But having at least your kicks and snares in there at the beginning gives you the tempo and the sort of the flavor of the overall track, and it gives you something to build on. Yeah, that would be where I would start, and I think that a lot of people should at least have something in their drums. Otherwise, they're just going to be making, just synth solos forever. Come on, anybody talking to me yet? Same questions from earlier. Did other people join the chat? No, that wasn't it. Damn. Man. Yeah. All right.
So I don't know how to word this, so I'm just gonna throw words at you.
Okay.
But what is it? But what is it that makes professional producers professional producers? What is it about you can just tell that this sounds good? Because I was watching some producer stream with deadmau5 or something. Mm-hmm. And he was working on a track, and he isolated one of the synths, and it was just a really simple sound. Mm-hmm. And I was like I can do that sound,
right.
But then he takes off solo, and it's back, and it sounds
right. Sounds awesome,
beautiful synth, and it's what am I missing?
All right, so I'll repeat the question as best I can for the people at home. The question is, what separates a beginner producer from a professional producer? And at the first part of the question, I was going to say, well, a professional person usually makes money doing it. Then the question went further, which was to say that he actually had an experience of watching an example of deadmau5 working in the studio, and he isolated one of the tracks he was working on, and it ended up sounding very, very simple, oh yeah, I could make that sound. But then when he released it back and let all the other tracks start playing together, it's oh yeah, that does sound like deadmau5, and it sounds better than anything I could make. And the question is, what is it about these people that's why do they sound better when they put those things together? And the difference is because they know how to mix. Is you can take a bunch of simple sounds, and they can be presets. They don't have to be really complex. But if you're putting them together in the right parts of the audio spectrum, remember how we talked about how the audio occupies different spaces. There's the stereo width, is it sitting in your left ear, or is it sitting in your right ear, or is it sitting right in front of you or right behind you, or does it sound like it's really far away or close? Use of reverb, use of delay, things like that. But doing it in the right amount and doing it tastefully. I think the difference between a professional and an amateur there is taste. Is knowing that this is going to sound good on a big system because you've had the experience of doing it a few times over and over again. And I hate to just be one of those people saying practice makes perfect, but that's really kind of what it boils down to. Is the more you work on it, the more you've tried it over and over again, the better your stuff gets. And I mean, that's how my tracks have gotten better. My first tracks I'm embarrassed of, and now I have ones that I can play out and I feel good about. And it takes having played my original ones going, oh God, that was terrible. Hope nobody ever listens to that again. And it takes being in that situation and being able to remember exactly why it sounded bad, and then going, okay, well, it had no thump. The very first few tracks I made had very, very little sub bass. And it was just because I didn't even know that there was such a thing when I first started. And then I was like, oh, okay, so that found out what this mysterious sub bass thing was, and it's it's not like it's subatomic or anything. You don't have to know anything. It's just like a pitch, an octave lower than every other bass. Oh, okay, cool. And usually a simpler waveform. Okay, cool. I think that's pretty easy to handle. But it's just finding out all these little things that you don't necessarily know when you begin, and as you learn them and you begin to, like, the sum of all of them is greater than, or what is it, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? So like all those things individually mean almost nothing, but when you put them all together, all of a sudden they have this convergence of power that none of them has individually, but together they become this a complete producer.